The subcommittees will come to order. I'm pleased today to be holding a joint hearing with the Health Subcommittee and the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee on such an important issue. The Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The FY 2009 Omnibus Appropriations Act directed the USDA, the FTC, CDC, and FTC to complete a study on food marketing to children and report back to Congress. Instead, what these four agencies, collectively known as the Interagency Working Group on Food Marketed to Children, or IWG, delivered was a sweeping set of voluntary principles for marketing foods to kids. These principles are based on nutritional standards that exceed and conflict with those of other government programs, some administered by these same agencies, such as the WIC program, the school lunch program, and the SNAP, the food stamp program. The guidelines are so restrictive that many healthy foods like low-fat yogurts, whole wheat bread, and 2% milk could not be marketed to those 17 and under. Cereals, even non-sweetened cereals, would not meet the IWG guidelines, including Cheerios. According to one analysis, 88 out of the 100 most advertised foods and drinks would be in violation of these standards. Please don't misunderstand. I am very concerned about the obesity epidemic in our nation. I have 4 young grandchildren. I want them to make good dietary and lifestyle choices and grow up healthy. And the parents, not government bureaucrats, are in the best position to see that that happens. Frankly, banning peanut butter commercials during hours when they may be watching TV is not going to accomplish that goal. The IWG should completely withdraw these recommendations and do what they were instructed to do by Congress in the fiscal year 2009 omnibus. Conduct a study and report the findings of the study and their recommendations to Congress. That report was due July 15, 2010. I yield the remainder of my time to the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate going out of order as I have another super committee meeting this morning, so I need to be there. But I thank you and Chairman Bono Mack for calling this hearing today. You know, 2.5 years ago, Congress established an interagency working group, IWG, composed of the FDA, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, USDA, and FTC. And the IWG was created to conduct a study and develop recommendations for standards on the marketing of food to children and teenagers. The study results and recommendations were supposed to take the form of a report to Congress, which we as the representative branch of government can consider as we decide whether and how to proceed. But instead of conducting the study or providing recommendations, the IWG unilaterally proposed guidelines that were so extreme that they would prevent the marketing to children of foods that most parents consider a win if their kids eat, such as yogurt, cheese sticks, even soup. Moreover, the IWG's definition of marketing was so broad that it endangered the philanthropic funding that many community sports programs and schools rely on to fund athletic activities, the one thing proven to combat childhood obesity. And while the initiative was portrayed as a helping hand to parents to reduce children's exposure to advertising for foods with limited nutritional value, to many of us and our constituents, that appeared to be the first step towards Uncle Sam planning our family meals. The IWG's preliminary proposal states flatly that foods would have to be reformulated and in some cases may disappear altogether. While the testimony suggests that the agencies are dealing with some of the most extreme aspects of the proposal, significant concerns still remain. And these guidelines are labeled as voluntary, which to me means that they are largely aspirational. But what happens when a litigious group sues a food manufacturer because it showed a commercial advertising a new kind of chocolate treat? Regardless of whether a child sees a commercial for that treat, the ultimate purchasing decision rests with the parent who purchases the groceries, and those groceries carry nutrition labels that every parent can read. I'm also very concerned regarding the impact of the guidelines on jobs. According to a study by IHS Consulting, the guidelines would lead to a loss of as many as 74,000 in just 1 year and perhaps 378,000 jobs over 4 years. The Senate report language called for a study and a report to Congress. We have neither a study nor a report. Rather, we have a quasi-regulatory maneuver that has drawn fire from a broad range of organizations and members of Congress. I am concerned about both the IWG's recommendations and the manner in which they were produced, going beyond the scope of that charge. I believe that this approach opens the door to needless and expensive litigation, and ultimately I believe there are much better approaches to improve the health of our children. Yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Health, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts. Childhood obesity is a tragic public health epidemic in this country, and the statistics are alarming. 1 out of every 3 children is affected by obesity, and over the last 3 decades, rates have skyrocketed. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, rates of obesity have doubled in children and tripled in teens. In addition, there are millions more kids who are just at the cusp and are in danger of becoming obese. As a result of this epidemic, health problems that were rarely seen in children 30 years ago are now quite common. A report conducted by the Trust for America's Health in 2009 highlighted that more and more children are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, hypertension, sleep apnea, joint problems, and depression, to name just a few. Shockingly, 1 in 3 children born in the year 2000 is expected to develop diabetes during his or her lifetime, and 25% of children between the ages of 5 and 10 years old have early warning signs for heart disease, such as high blood pressure and high cholesterol levels. What's so important to understand is that these children are likely to continue having health problems as they age into adulthood. Studies have shown that up to 80% of obese children will become obese adults. Some experts have even predicted that if the trends in childhood obesity continue, we'll, for the first time in American history, see a generation that lives sicker and dies earlier than their parents. Many factors contribute to the public health problem. Personal habits definitely play a part, but so does less exercise and lack of access to healthy foods. Regardless of the reasons, the bottom line is that children's diets are too high in calories, saturated in trans fat, refined sugars, and salt, and too low in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and calcium. As a result, they have an increased risk of many serious and costly diseases. We also know that marketing is a factor in the types of foods children eat. A 2008 FTC report found that the food industry spent more than $1.6 billion in 2006 alone to market messages to kids promoting foods that often are high in calories and low in nutrition. In 2006, the Institute of Medicine released a study on food marketing to children that examined the role that marketing may play as a determinant of the nutritional status of children and the ways in which marketing approaches might be adopted to help address the epidemic of childhood obesity. In fact, as a result of this study, the industry launched their own initiative designed to shift the mix of foods advertised to children to encourage healthier dietary choices and healthy lifestyles. I believe that our government has an obligation to work with industry leaders, parents, schools, and advocates to address and hopefully reverse the trends of childhood obesity. The recommendations by the IWG being examined today are one step in that direction. I, for one, certainly share the goal of improving children's diets and addressing the high rates of childhood obesity. Is the IWS proposal perfect? No, not at all. In fact, I think as written, many of these recommendations are unworkable. But today we'll hear from many witnesses, including the consumer advocates, who will attest to that. But that is why the proposal poses 30 specific questions designed to elicit input on a variety of issues, so I fully expect the IWG to carefully consider the many comments that were received. I do not agree with some of our witnesses who believe that the IWG proposal should be withdrawn completely and instead endorse an industry-only approach. Today's hearing will allow our witnesses to publicly provide important input into the development of a complete set of recommendations to Congress. If we want to facilitate and induce real change, it's critical that any voluntary guidelines encourage and incentivize American companies to participate. I look forward to working with my colleagues, and I'd like to now yield the remainder of my time to Representative Schakowsky.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me. You know, we're going to spend our time today attacking the interagency working group whose mission was simply to I'm looking for exactly the words. The working group's job was to submit a report to Congress, and that's it. And that's what Congress told the group to do. This is not a regulatory document. It doesn't enforce, but it does inform the conversation we have about a very serious problem, and that is childhood obesity. I did want to refer Mr. Vladek to a myths and facts article that you wrote some time ago, and referred to what the chairman was saying. It's the parents that are supposed to do this. And the myth is that this proposal represents the government's attempt to do a parent's job. Absolutely not. Parents, not the government, make decisions, but the proposal is designed to support, not supplant, moms and dads. After all, more marketing that kids see is for foods that make up a healthy diet, kids will start asking for healthier foods. And so I think that we need an open mind to listen to these reasonable proposals. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady, and the chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes for my opening statement. And today the evidence is all around us. There is an indisputable link between childhood obesity and diabetes. It's an issue that I've been working on for many years. More and more overweight kids are leading to more and more cases of full-blown diabetes among children all across America. That alarming trend demands our attention. But what is far less clear to me is whether the interagency working group's proposed nutrition principles are even achievable for most food groups and what effect they could have on food prices. Hopefully we can get some straight answer to these and some other very important questions before committing to a national policy that may shrink family budgets but no waistlines. Clearly, the IWG's initial proposal went way too far. It had a dangerously high content of plausibility. To its credit, the FTC did substitute a little common sense for an otherwise rigid menu that could leave American businesses as well as consumers with a bad case of heartburn. People are smart enough to recognize that Girl Scout cookies or a cake bought at a bake sale are not health foods, and they should act accordingly. But that said, I still remain very concerned that healthy foods like yogurt could wind up not meeting these new standards. So much for counting calories. I'm also concerned by a lack of science-based evidence in some of the IWG's recommendations. For example, despite study after study, the link between saturated fat and obesity remains inconclusive. Is there a plausible connection? Yes. But is there a definitive one? No. Over the years, Americans have decreased their saturated animal fat intake, and yet cardiovascular disease rates remain mostly unchanged. I'm also worried about what may happen every time there's a new cook in the kitchen. While these standards are voluntary, they can be changed on a whim, creating uncertainty for both businesses and consumers. Let's rethink that approach before the standards become finalized. As a former small business owner, I'm troubled as well by the impact that the IWG's nutrition principles could have on smaller U.S. companies, which often struggle to comply with these types of standards. I'm anxious to learn what steps are being taken to ensure that thousands of Americans don't lose their jobs at a time when unemployment nationwide stands at a stubborn 9.1%. And finally, why hasn't this committee received the IWG report, which was supposed to have been delivered to Congress by July 15th of 2010? Frankly, we'd like to find out what you have been cooking up in the kitchen. Right now, I'm not sure. I like the smell of it. And at that point, I will yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, the vice chair of the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome to our witnesses. As a mother and a grandmother, I have always been concerned with diet, nutrition, obesity. This goes back to my interest in foods and nutrition when I was a young 4-H club member in South Mississippi. I love that issue. And for decades, I have watched as government has tried to dictate portion sizes and regulation, but I have come to realize nothing replaces understanding of the food pyramid and the basic food groups and how those impact your body and your life. I think that the nanny state, that government should be held responsible for how its IWG marketing rules will suppress free speech, choice, harm our economy, and fail at reducing childhood obesity. The government should stop pretending after all these decades that it has the answers, because it does not. Big government is no replacement for parental involvement in our children's everyday lives and their understanding of the food that they consume, what they eat, and the individual that they become. Furthermore, private industries are already sensitive to consumer demands, and they are bowing to parental concerns. I see this in the choices for my grandchildren. These broad marketing restrictions are supposedly voluntary, but it's clear they will inevitably form the basis for NGO attacks, shareholder actions, and private litigation. This hearing is an opportunity to explore these concerns further. I thank you all for your interest in being here today. I want to let both panels know that we look forward to having them here, that we look forward to furthering this discussion and to visiting with you about what is a thoughtful way to move forward with helping to educate parents and children as to what they are consuming. Now, I'm one of those that I cook for my children and grandchildren every single day, every single weekend. One of the favorite incentives I have for my two grandchildren is an old Mr. M&M. And when you flip his hand, he dispenses a little M&M. After they eat the appropriate amounts of meat and veggies and a little bread and drink their milk, Mr. M&M gives them that candy token that they are looking for as their reward for doing things right. It is my choice as a grandmother. We don't need the FTC. We don't need the IWG. We do not need the federal government weighing in.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you. To the two subcommittee chairs, Chairman Pitts and Chairman Bono Mack, thank you for holding today's hearing on the Interagency Working Group's preliminary proposed nutrition principles on food marketed to children. Children's health and well-being are paramount. I think we can all agree on that. We must do all we can to ensure the next generation of leaders are as healthy as possible. To that end, Congress directed the Federal Trade Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control, and USDA to conduct a study and develop recommendations for standards for the marketing of food when such marketing targets children who are 17 years old or younger. It seems that the working group took that charge and tried to complete as thorough a document as possible, resulting in the preliminary proposed nutrition principles to guide industry self-regulatory efforts. The working group proposal includes many great suggestions, like incorporating more fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains into a child's daily diet in addition to the M&Ms. The working group also suggests limiting nutrients that are generally accepted as not being healthy in large quantities like sodium and saturated fat, trans fat, and added sugars. I agree with these principles. I also believe, however, that certain parts of the preliminary working group report recommended overly specific standards that would be difficult for industry to meet. In 2006, in response to an Institute of Medicine report, the Council of Better Business Bureaus and the member companies of its Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative instituted a wide-reaching self-regulatory standard representing the overwhelming majority of companies marketing food products to children. This initiative's goal was to devote at least half of all advertising directed at children to healthier food options and a healthier lifestyle. The initiative's self-regulatory requirements were recently expanded to be more rigorous. Now, when marketing to children 12 and under, member companies must advertise healthier products 100% of the time. Member companies cannot pay for or actively seek product placement in programming directed to children. Member companies are not permitted to advertise in schools serving pre-kindergarten through 6th grade. Member companies have also reformulated more than 100 products advertised to children. They have decreased caloric levels and reduced sodium, sugar, and fat levels, all of these voluntarily. It is true that children want what is advertised to them on television, magazines, or in a store, whether it's a sugary cereal or the Red Ryder BB gun made famous recently, but it is ultimately the responsibility of parents and caregivers to make informed and thoughtful decisions about the kind of food their child eats, just as they do for the kind of toys they play with. The government can play a role, however, in the overall health of our children. Nutritional education to both parents and children can go a long way in helping to develop long-term healthy eating habits. Last month, USDA retired the 20-year-old food pyramid and replaced it with My Plate, a simpler and more relatable way to teach parents and children what they should be eating and how much. The government also runs the website nutrition.gov, where anyone can learn more about weight management, dietary supplements, and even provides recommendations for healthy shopping, cooking, and meal planning. I share the President's goal of ending childhood obesity and related conditions like high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes. I respect the working group's commitment to the same, but I also believe the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative should be encouraged and given a chance to test out their impact. Moreover, government entities involved in the working group should not ignore or forget their important role providing nutritional education in schools and on television, in print, and online. Parents must be able to make informed decisions about what their children eat through exposure to all food choices, the ones that are good for them, the ones that they should enjoy sparingly. And so, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for convening the hearing. I look forward to the remainder. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and Chair now recognizes Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have an opening statement I'm going to put in the record. I want to do a little focus group with all the people in this room. We've got about 200 people. How many had a sit-down, home-cooked meal with your family last night? Raise your hand. Well, I'm impressed that many of you did. That's good. We had about, I'd say, 25% of the audience. You folks are the solution to our problem. It's not the government giving these guidelines, and the agencies here are well-meaning, I'm sure. It's the fact that we don't take the time to do what we know is right. I have a little condo here in Washington. I know this is about children's obesity, but this is illustrative. I have a gas stove that has an oven and a 4-top cooker burners. It hadn't been connected for 20 years. Okay? I have a microwave that I use to do microwave popcorn. When I got elected to Congress, I weighed 160 pounds. I weigh 215 on a good day now. And it's not because I don't know what's nutritious to eat. It's because I don't take the time. I go to a reception, or I go to the whip's office, or I go to a dinner, or I stop at McDonald's. If I'm really trying to be healthy, I'll stop at Subway and maybe get a sandwich. My wife is an excellent cook. And when I'm in Texas at home, I would say about half the time we actually have a sit-down meal with her and my 6-year-old son. But she works full-time too. So we go to fast food, whether it's Pizza Hut or McDonald's or Brahms or Wendy's or Popeye's Chicken or whatever, and on the weekends maybe we have the meals. The problem is not government guidelines. The problem is not knowing what's nutritious. The problem is that in our world today we just don't take the time to do what we know we need to do. And you can't regulate that. You can't mandate that. We can't mandate that everybody sit down with their family for an hour and a half and have a balanced meal like Congresswoman Blackburn does with her children and grandchildren when she's in Tennessee. So this is going to be a good hearing. We're going to have a lot of good sound bites. But I haven't heard anybody on either side of the aisle, my friends on the Democratic side or the Republican side over here, saying that the government giving us mandatory, even voluntary regulations is going to solve this problem. It's up to each of us individually to do what we know needs to be done. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I want to yield, I think, a minute to Mr. Olson of Texas.
Chairman, happy to recognize Mr. Olson.
I want to thank the Chairman Emeritus and my colleague from Texas. I'd like to thank Chairman Upton, Bono Mack, and Pitts for calling this very important hearing. Last year, I visited a Frito-Lay plant in the district I represent with my 11-year-old son. The plant has 465 employees. There's another Frito-Lay office in my home district, which has 181 employees. That's 646 Frito-Lay jobs in the 22nd Congressional District of Texas. These jobs involve the manufacture, sale, distribution, and marketing of snack food products, including products that qualify as healthy under the FDA regulations. However, under the proposal by the Interagency Working Group on Food Marketed to Children, many of these products would be restricted, and the jobs that produce them would be at risk. It's my job as a parent, not the government's job, to ensure that my children eat healthy foods and develop healthy habits. We don't need the federal government dictating which foods can be marketed to children. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Yield back.
I'd like to yield the balance of the time to Mr. Kinsinger.
Well, I thank you, and thank you for yielding and for the opportunity for the witnesses to come in and testify today. 2009 report language included in the Omnibus Appropriation Act directed to IWG to complete a study and submit a report to Congress with its recommendations. Congress is still waiting. Instead, the IWG devised voluntary nutrition standards for food marketing to children that would require product reformulation with no scientific evidence that these new marketing restrictions would lead to long-term changes in eating behaviors or obesity rates. I was elected to Congress by Illinois families that want a government that fosters a safe and a free economy, a government that's limited in its scope and effective in its goals. This proposal is counter to that. As many as 74,000 food manufacturing jobs are in jeopardy with these guidelines. These jobs are held by parents working hard to feed their children. It's time we return government to the people and rein in Washington's culture of senseless regulation. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and hope the IWG sees the need in providing a science-based report that includes how the proposal will benefit children's health and what it will do to the cost of our nation and jobs and economic growth. And I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me get this straight. Congress said that we should create an interactive task force from the Centers for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, the United States Department of Agriculture, the Federal Trade Commission. We asked that this task force be set up to give recommendations about a real problem. And what is this real problem? There's an epidemic of obesity among our children. This is a serious health matter. A third of our kids are now overweight or obese. It's a public health problem. It's also a problem of national defense. Pentagon complains they can't find enough kids who are not so overweight that they can't go into the military. It's a problem any way you look at it. Now, it's a complex problem, but the food industry can contribute to this effort of helping to educate the public. Now, how can they do that? Well, they could talk about safer foods, healthier foods, and not target our kids. The food industry spends $1.6 billion on marketing to the kids each year. And when they're marketing candy, they're not saying take only one M&M from your grandma. They're saying eat M&Ms, eat candy, eat all the food that we know is not great, but kids don't know. So we got this interagency task force, and they came out with a preliminary report. And our committee's going crazy. We called a hearing. The Republicans who run this committee called a hearing. It's a preliminary report. It means they want to get comments. So before they get comments from anybody else, we're going to give them our comments. And what are the comments of the Republicans? Their preliminary proposal is extreme. We don't want Uncle Sam planning our family meals. It's going to have an impact on jobs. That's what they always say. They even have a figure, 70,000 or 700,000 jobs would be lost each year. I don't know where they got that figure. Is it going to lead to litigation? Well, I don't know how it's going to lead to litigation if there's a reason to sue because people manufacture and sell legal products that may or may not be healthy. That's not a tort as I understood everything I studied in law school. And just because there's a government guideline for a voluntary effort, I don't know how that leads to more litigation. So the Republicans say it's going to lead to litigation. It's big government. We better find out what the impact are on our prices for food. There's not enough of a scientific basis to even deal with this issue. Big government is not a replacement for parents, as if anybody said big government was a replacement for parents. This is a way for the industry can do something on a voluntary basis to help deal with a real public health problem. It's a way to educate the public. It's a way not to have our kids subjected to advertising that they don't know how to deal with. They're kids. And then we hear it's too difficult to implement. Well, if it's too difficult to implement, then the industry doesn't have to implement it. I cannot believe this hearing. I cannot believe the statements that I've been hearing from the other side of the aisle. This is an interim report. They're asking for comments. The comments seem to suggest that they shouldn't have this interim, they shouldn't have a task force. Well, the Congress set it up. We want all the rhetoric. We want limited government, freedom in our country, no regulated markets, on and on and on. Well, let me tell my Republican friends, if we did nothing, the epidemic of obesity in children is not going to stop. It's going to continue. The food manufacturers and advertisers are not going to change what has been working for them, because what has been working for them is adding to their profits. So somebody should do something, if not government, suggesting ideas. Will industry act on its own? I just find this an amazing hearing. The only thing I can analogize it to is the hearing we had after all the tobacco issues that we discussed for many years. The Republicans took charge and we never heard anything more about tobacco. And suddenly we had a hearing about tobacco. And the hearing was how smokeless tobacco should be encouraged as a way for smokers to give up smoking. It was geared to promoting an industry that no doubt supported financially many of the members. I wonder if this hearing is about the same subject. Yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. And now we'll turn our attention to the panel. Our first panel of witnesses will include William Dietz, Director of the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Then we have Dr. Robert Post, Deputy Director of the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and then David Vladek, Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. Thank you all very much for coming today. We have your prepared statements in front of us all, and we recognize you to summarize them, and we'll begin with you, Dr. Dietz.
Thank you. Chairwoman Bono Mack and members of the subcommittees. It's a great honor for me to be here today to talk to you about the interagency work group on food marketed.
Excuse me, Dr. Dietz, would you please pull the microphone closer to your mouth?
Oh, I'm sorry.
And make sure that it's turned on?
Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Before coming to CDC, I was a professor of pediatrics at Tufts University School of Medicine in Boston, and I'm a prior president of the Obesity Society and prior president of the American Society for Clinical Nutrition. My statement provides background on the burden of childhood obesity and cardiovascular disease risk factors, a discussion of how advertising and the marketing of foods and beverages influence the diets of children and youth, and an overview of the Institute of Medicine's 2006 report on food marketed to children and youth. The two greatest diet-related health threats to children and adolescents in the United States are obesity and the development of cardiovascular disease risk factors. Our most recent data indicate that 17% of U.S. children and adolescents are obese. The caloric imbalance necessary to reverse the obesity epidemic in children is surprisingly small and ranges from 30 to 170 calories depending on the age of the child. Modest shifts in consumption can reduce this excess. Obese children are at greater risk for a variety of health conditions. Approximately 30% of obese children have high blood pressure, 10% of all children have elevated cholesterol, and obesity increases the risk of elevated cholesterol even further. Obese children also have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes and multiple other health problems. Virtually every system in the body is affected. In addition, obesity may lead to severe psychological and social problems, such as absenteeism from school, discrimination, victimization, and poor self-esteem. Although elevated blood pressure and elevated cholesterol accompany obesity, and saturated fat in the diets of children are also important contributors. Sodium and saturated fat in the diets are also important contributors. Reductions in salt intake could decrease adult heart attacks by 9% and adult strokes by 14%. The poor quality of the diets of 0 to 5-year-old children is emphasized by recent data from the Feeding Infants and Toddlers study conducted by Nestle. This study showed that 45% of 1 to 2-year-old children and 78% of 2 to 4-year-old children have sodium intakes above the upper limit recommended by the National Academy of Sciences. 75% of children consume excessive saturated fat. Approximately 30% of children consume no vegetables on the survey day, and 20 to 30% of children consume no fruit. Approximately 30% of children are consuming pre-sweetened cereals. High caloric density foods are frequently consumed as snacks, and almost 40% of 2 to 4-year-old children consume fruit-flavored drinks daily. These dietary patterns increase the risks of obesity and cardiovascular disease. Furthermore, food marketing to children leads to increased consumption of foods of low nutritional value. The 2006 IOM report on food marketing concluded that, quote, food and beverage marketing practices geared to children and youth are out of balance with healthful diets and contribute to an environment that puts their health at risk. Specifically, the IOM report found that in 2 to 11-year-olds, there's strong evidence of the effect of food marketing on food and beverage preferences, food and beverage purchases, food and purchase requests, short-term consumption, and moderate evidence on the effects of food advertising on food and beverage beliefs and usual dietary intake among 2 to 5-year-olds. We also know that there's a linear relationship between television viewing and obesity, and it appears that food marketing to children plays an important role. The more television a child watches, the more likely they are to consume foods while watching television, and those foods are more likely to be the foods that are advertised on television. Furthermore, several studies have now shown that reductions in television time are associated with weight reduction without increases in physical activity. This observation suggests that the effects of television on childhood obesity are not due to television viewing displacing more vigorous physical activity. Multiple studies have shown that among products marketed most frequently to children are sugar-sweetened beverages, sugar-sweetened cereals, restaurant foods, and salty snacks, the same types of foods that contribute to obesity and cardiovascular disease risk factors. Foods containing meaningful amounts of fruits, vegetables, or whole grains are rarely advertised. We want to support parents in providing healthful foods to their children. The advertising directed at children prompts them to nag their parents to purchase the products that are marketed to them. The high fat, high salt, and high sugar foods consumed as a result of these ads increases the risk of obesity and cardiovascular disease, while the provision of meaningful amounts of healthful alternatives to these foods reduces this risk. The interagency work group is committed to developing principles for foods marketed to children that can improve the health of our children and ultimately reduce health care costs.
Thank you, Dr. Dietz. Dr. Post, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Bono Mack and Chairman Pitts and members of the committee and subcommittees, it's an honor to have this opportunity to provide this statement for today's hearing on the interagency work group on food marketed to children. I'm Dr. Robert Post. I'm Deputy Director of the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I represent USDA on the IWG. My role of reviewing the technical basis for the IWG's nutrition principles is commensurate with my role as the policy official leading the development of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The current epidemic of overweight and obese children in the United States is a major concern for USDA. The 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans reports that eating patterns established in childhood often track into later life, making early intervention on adopting healthy nutrition and physical activity behaviors a priority. As you know, the USDA supports a number of food and nutrition policies and programs that aim to improve not only the nutrition, but also the overall health and well-being of America's youth. Primary prevention of obesity and related risk factors is the single most powerful public health approach to reversing America's obesity epidemic over the long term. Lifelong habits are developed throughout childhood, and every opportunity should be provided to build healthy habits at the earliest stages of life. Among the strategies reported in the dietary guidelines that can be used to help create and promote healthy lifestyles for children is supporting effective policies to limit food and beverage marketing of unhealthy products to children. Since May 2009, the IWG has met regularly to study and assess the science, critically examine the components of voluntary efforts already being employed by various organizations, and exhaustively work through scenarios of applying different criteria to individual foods and foods marketed as meals. To satisfy the directive of the 2009 Omnibus Appropriations Act, which called for the creation of the IWG, the working group reviewed the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's comprehensive report on nutrition research, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, regulations promulgated by the FDA and USDA concerning nutrient content and health claims, and relevant IOM reports, as well as nutrition standards developed by industry groups and various public and private entities prior to developing recommendations. The recommendations represent voluntary recommendations that might inform and guide industry efforts to voluntarily change the promotion of foods and beverages to children. Based on this study, in April 2011, the IWG released for public comment a draft set of preliminary proposed nutrition principles for foods marketed to children and solicited public comment on the draft recommendations to gain insights on the practicality and feasibility of the proposed recommendations that would be in a report to Congress. About 29,000 comments were received, 100 or so of which provided substantive discussion of the tentative proposed nutrition recommendations. Also during this period, the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, CFBAI, and its participants released a new set of food category-specific uniform nutrition criteria that are being adopted by all members of the CFBAI. The CFBAI is a voluntary self-regulation program comprising many of the nation's largest food and beverage companies. It's designed to encourage advertising of healthier dietary choices to children under the age of 12. There are 17 food manufacturers and restaurant chains that have signed on to this effort. The newly released criteria represent a significant change on how the program operates, as each participating company has now agreed to follow a unified set of nutrition criteria. The goal is that participating companies will adopt these new criteria by December 31st, 2013. According to the organization, its new criteria impose significant challenges on the participating companies and require reformulation of many of their products if they wish to continue advertising them after the criteria go into effect. The CFBAI estimates that one-third of the products currently advertised to children do not meet the criteria. On review, it appears that with the new uniform criteria, the industry has made considerable efforts to design and reformulate its products closer to the principles tentatively proposed by IWG. The new nutrition criteria of CFBAI appear to be a step forward in changing the food advertising landscape while also taking into consideration the feasibility of manufacturers making meaningful changes to the nutrient content of food products. There are many aspects or several aspects of the criteria that are helpful in simplifying the IWG's preliminary approach. Overall, the CFBAI standards present, in many respects, a reasonable set of criteria to consider for revising the IWG preliminary proposal. While the criteria represent a very good start towards the marketing of healthier foods, food manufacturers should continue to work at improving the nutritional content of foods that they intend to market to children. We believe that additional changes to nutrition principles for advertising can be considered over time. And we believe that manufacturers will, in fact, make earnest progress. Thank you very much, Chairman and members of the committee and subcommittees, for this opportunity to provide USDA's views.
Thank you, Dr. Post. Mr. Vladeck, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Bono Mack and members of the subcommittee. I'm David Vladeck, Director of the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the important issue of food marketing to children. Every parent knows how difficult it is to get children to eat a healthy diet. We rarely see children having tantrums in the produce aisles, pleading for mom or dad to load up the shopping cart with broccoli or Brussels sprouts. Indeed, a cottage industry has formed to advise parents on ways to smuggle healthy ingredients into foods their children will eat. The FTC wants to support parents in their challenging quest to get their kids to eat healthier foods, including, by the way, yogurt, peanut butter, Cheerios, some of the other foods that were mentioned this morning. But let me be clear about this, not by issuing regulations. The FTC has long encouraged strong and meaningful industry self-regulation. We have sent reports to Congress with recommendations on a broad range of self-regulatory initiatives, including media violence and alcohol marketing, in addition to food marketing to children. Regardless of what role marketing may or may not play in the problem of childhood obesity, the marketing ingenuity of America's food manufacturers and entertainment providers can be an important part of the solution. The Commission began to focus on the issue of childhood obesity in July 2005, when the FTC and the Department of Health and Human Services held a workshop on marketing, self-regulation, and childhood obesity, which, by the way, sparked the industry self-regulatory program. Several months ago, acting pursuant to a bipartisan directive from Congress, the working group released for comment proposed recommendations for voluntary industry self-regulation. 29,000 comments were received. Now, Congress did not require us to seek public comment or engage with stakeholders, but we did so because we wanted the working group process that was used to shape these recommendations to be as open and transparent as possible. And because it is ultimately up to the food companies to decide whether to adopt the guidelines, we needed their input to ensure that our recommendations to Congress would be attainable for industry. The working group took Congress's directive seriously, and the draft recommendations we issued were ambitious. As we studied the comments, however, we realized that perhaps we were too ambitious. One significant comment came from the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, the industry self-regulatory group, the CFBAI. The CFBAI's comments announced substantial improvements in its self-regulatory program, not just by tightening standards, but most notably by adopting uniform nutritional criteria for its 17 members companies, making the program much more transparent and strong. The framework of the CFBAI program has much to commend it, and I am confident that this framework will be reflected in the final working group report. But the FTC's focus and expertise is on marketing, not nutrition. So let me highlight for you the three most significant marketing changes that I contemplate with respect to the final working group report. Of course, these changes will have to be approved by the Commission and the other working group agencies, but I believe that these changes will focus the final report on ads targeted directly to children, and will thereby avoid having the working group's recommendations covering marketing activities that are family-oriented or directed to a more general audience. First, I anticipate that the final report will not encompass adolescents 12 to 17 within the scope of covered marketing, except for certain in-school marketing activities. Second, philanthropic activities and entertaining and sporting events also do not appear to warrant inclusion with marketing that is child-directed. And third, I do not anticipate that the final report will recommend that food companies change the trade dress elements of their packaging or remove brand equity characters from food products that do not meet the nutritional recommendations. Parents don't have an easy task when it comes to getting their kids to eat healthier foods. The FTC is committed to working with its sister agencies and all stakeholders to make that burden on parents less daunting. On behalf of the Commission, I would like to thank the committee and subcommittees for this opportunity to present testimony on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vladeck. And the Chair will recognize herself for the first 5 minutes of questioning. And we'll start with you, Mr. Vladeck. It's good to see you again. Different issue that we're working on today. But before I go to you, I just want to sort of answer something that Mr. Waxman had said. He and I had worked together on tobacco issues. I've been a staunch supporter of the anti-tobacco work, both on the federal level and the state. And I also have been working very hard to address the issue of prescription drug abuse in our adolescents. And I wish that the panel would devote as much attention to that as we are to this. You spoke about kids having tantrums in the vegetable aisles. And, when I was a child, I'm having flashbacks to my own childhood as I sit here and listen to you. And I remember being forced, I don't know if anybody in the audience was forced to eat cooked liver as a child, that it would smell up the house. Clearly some people were. It would smell up the house for a week. But our mothers thought it was good for us. And you know what? They made us eat it because they thought it was good for us. But I've been looking at this issue of childhood obesity for years. Dr. Frist and I introduced a bill years ago, the Impact Act, to try to address this problem. But I don't think this is the answer. I don't think we're there yet. And I recognize all of the work you have done, and I'm happy to continue to work with you. But I just don't think we're there yet. And Mr. Vladeck, you testified that the FTC is currently completing a follow-up study of food marketing to children to its 2008 study, and it will submit it to Congress later this year. Shouldn't the working group shouldn't the working group report wait at a minimum until the FTC has concluded that study and the study required by the 2009 appropriations language? And wouldn't the working group benefit from the FTC's report?
I think that that is a possible approach. We are, of course, dealing with a mandate from Congress that required us to finish our work a year ago and has been pointed out on numerous occasions this morning. We're late. This has been a complicated task, and part of the delay has been occasioned by our effort to engage closely with stakeholders. This process has been a long one, in part because we've held 2 workshops, we've solicited comments. Industry has, to its credit, come forward with a dramatic shift in its own self-regulatory approach that we need to take into account. I don't know whether at this point it makes sense for us to wait for what will be at least another 6 months or so while we analyze the data that we got from industry. I think and I think my colleague's testimony this morning makes this clear. I think we're at a point where I wouldn't say that there's a clear convergence between the working group and industry, but the gap has been narrowed to a point where I think we should go ahead, try to finish up. These are voluntary guidelines.
Let me just jump ahead again, why I think we're missing the boat, and I think it's a mistake because one hand of government doesn't want to talk to the other or wait to work together collaboratively on this. And I'll turn to Dr. Post and Dr. Dietz for their answer to this. I grew up as a gymnast, and I would spend an awful lot of time in the gym as a child. I mean, I'm 5'7". It was like kind of a dumb sport to do when you're a kid, being so tall, but I did it. I literally grew up on SpaghettiOs and some other cereal. That's what I would eat every day. You testified that you do not believe that the lack of exercise is contributing to this problem. I believe that's what I heard Dr. Post say, that you have it. Is that what you said? I might have misheard you. What is the interplay between exercise and diet? Where does it come in?
In fact, the 2010 dietary guidelines stress that we are, in fact, at energy imbalance. We need to balance our calories in with physical.
Like, what does that mean to a mother? I mean, you're basically saying the amount of television and what you eat, that it doesn't matter. That's really what you said. And again, I think you all are trying to throw a panacea out there. And I'll tell you as a mom, the one thing this is even far more complicated than that. Mothers are looking for time and answers to, how do we raise our children when we're busy working and how do we do it? Maybe we have to look at the fact that mothers are busy and stressed, and it's easier to grab a box from the center aisle than to go to the produce aisles. But this troubles me because I am convinced that our children have to get active. And if they were active, they wouldn't be watching the TV, and they might not see the ads that you're afraid of. Is that not true?
We are very supportive in all of our programs at USDA to balance the idea of energy and physical activity or calories in. I think, though, that the comment was made by Dr. Dietz in the connection between advertising.
Okay, can Dr. Dietz then have the last 22 seconds to solve this problem for me in 22 seconds?
I think physical activity in children is critically important, and the best data we have suggests that it's declined over time. It's certainly a contributor. But one of the things about obesity is that I don't think any single answer is going to work. I think that we require a multi-sectoral, multi-component approach, and physical activity is one of those approaches.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I appreciate your answer very much. And the Chair will recognize Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. Mr. Vladeck, in the Trade Commission's memo accompanying the release of the proposed standards back in April, the Federal Trade Commission indicated that the goal was to steer children away from foods of little or no nutritional value. My question is, what evidence do you have that cereal and foods the FDA has deemed healthy are foods of little or no nutritional value?
Well, I will ultimately refer that question to my colleagues who work for the nutrition agencies. The way our approach worked was quite simple. We want to encourage kids to eat healthy foods that make meaningful contributions to diet. Many cereals do that. And we wanted to discourage kids from eating foods that do not make a meaningful contribution to their diet. How the FDA and USDA categorize foods, that's not the FTC's expertise, and I would defer to my colleagues.
All right, Dr. Dietz, Dr. Post, you want to try that one? Yes. Yeah.
One of the principles that we included was that foods marketed to children should contain a meaningful amount of a food to encourage according to the dietary guidelines, such as fruits, vegetables, whole grains, or dairy. So it was less about restricting advertising and more about encouraging the advertising of foods that would contribute to a healthy diet.
And to add to that, of course, the idea is that we need to consume less often certain food constituents like sodium and saturated fat and certainly added sugars. And so there was an emphasis here again.
The foods that provide those macronutrients for maintenance of a healthy body weight, it is the consumption and expenditure of calories that is most important. Health and Human Services has said that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, whether it comes from fat or carbohydrate. Anything eaten in excess can lead to weight gain. You can lose weight by eating less calories and by increasing your physical activity. Despite Congress's directive to consider calories, and despite your own agency's statements that calories are the key to maintaining a healthy weight, your proposal seems does not address calories. Help me with this, please. Either one of you? Yeah.
Yes, I'd be happy to. The thresholds for the added sugars, solid fats, are a way to get to the calories issue. By setting thresholds, some level, the tentative or the preliminary proposal, in fact, had a proxy for the calories issue. And by promoting food groups like low-fat and fat-free dairy, more nutrient-dense foods, fruits and vegetables, that's also a way of decreasing calories from added sugars and solid fats. So we dealt with the calories issue by the types of nutrients and food components that are the subject of the proposal.
And just to add to that, we were compelled by the capacity of certain foods to auto-regulate weight independent of calories. So we knew that low energy density foods, foods that contained fewer calories per gram, such as fruits and vegetables, were more filling than other foods. And in addition, we knew that fiber increased the regulation of satiety. So that if those foods contained a meaningful amount of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, satiety would be automatically regulated independent of calories.
All right. I'm going to start this question. I might have to finish it during the second round. Dr. Dietz, industry is concerned about obesity. In fact, broadcasters donate tremendous amount of time to produce and air public service announcements, including anti-obesity public service announcements to their viewers and listeners. Earlier this year, NAB coordinated a Let's Move flash workout featuring Beyonce in support of First Lady Obama's initiative aimed at curbing childhood obesity. Middle school kids across the country participated in this endeavor, as well as local radio and television stations, to underscore the importance of physical activity as part of a healthy lifestyle for children. I'm going to continue this question, Madam Chairman, in the second round. I yield back.
Without it, okay.
Yes.
I appreciate that. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pitts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize for having to step out and testify in front of the Rules Committee. In FY 2009, Congress has explicitly directed the IWG to complete a study and a report to Congress. However, the guidelines you released in late April did not include a study, and the guidelines you developed are directed to industry, not a report to Congress. I have a series of questions here that each of you can respond to. Have you calculated the impact of your food marketing restrictions on charitable organizations like food banks, Dr. Dietz?
No, we did not. That was not part of the scope of the report as we were instructed.
Okay. Have you calculated the impact of your food marketing restrictions on jobs in the food industry? Any of you can respond.
No, we have not, and I know that that some numbers have been promoted today that suggest that jobs will be lost, and I think one of the people in the second panel is going to present data which contradict that assertion.
What about, have you calculated the impact of your food marketing restrictions on jobs in the broadcasting industry or cable?
No, we have not, although we think that food advertising, food marketing to children will continue, and that, for example, the promotion of healthy products that would replace those that are currently advertised would result in no loss of jobs in the advertising industry.
Can I add
yes,
a comment?
Mr. Vladeck.
The CFBAI proposal, which moves, which sort of moves the discussion in ways that we had not anticipated when we issued our preliminary report, I think reflect industry's view that it can move ahead without sacrificing economically. I assume that the CFBAI proposal is based on industry's clear-eyed assessment of the costs and benefits of making these changes to their products. And so, part of the concerns that you're raising, I think, go to the economic rationality of our proposal. I think that, there's been a change in the game, and it's not at all clear to me that those concerns are necessarily going to have traction given where the industry itself has moved to.
Well, what about, did you consider the impact of your food marketing restrictions on the price of food?
Well, sir, we asked comment broadly in large measure to have a dialogue with stakeholders, including food producers and marketers, about what would be the impact of adoption of these guidelines. So, those are the kinds of issues that we tried to discuss. We did not get in our comments any information of the kind that you've just identified. This was not an issue that was raised by any of the 29,000 commenters that commented on the preliminary draft.
Okay. The nutrition standards underlying your proposal are inconsistent with and stricter than the standards USDA applies to school lunches or the WIC program. Does it make sense that the government has two sets of nutrition standards, one for the food a child can be served in school and a second for food advertisement a child can see on a Cartoon Network? And why?
The thread that holds all of the food and nutrition programs together in the federal sector is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and that, in fact, is the foundation that sets directional approaches for nutrients and foods, more food groups, less nutrients of health concern. And so that is, in fact, the way all of our efforts are joined. When it comes to differences between the IWG's proposal and programs like WIC, we've got to understand that these are programs that focus on a particular need for a particular circumstance or a client that has particular nutritional needs. So the market baskets would be different, that food meal pattern would be different for postpartum moms, for children up to 5 years who are looking for nutritional assistance. And the same thing would apply to the school program where a complete meal is dependent on for giving the nutrients and the food groups that a student needs. So you would see those differences. There really isn't a valid comparison. But the foundation is the same, and that's the Dietary Guidelines for Americans.
Yeah, if private industry, my time is almost up, is already doing this, doesn't that mean that government action isn't necessary?
Well, we were asked by Congress to submit a report, and we will do that. I think that government action here is simply giving our views about what would be the kinds of foods we'd like to see marketed to kids. We're not, again, I can't stress enough that these are voluntary guidelines, and our mandate was to help give guidance to industry, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes Mr. Engel for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Vladeck, I'm glad you reemphasized voluntary guidelines, because this is all that this is. I've heard some comments from my friends on the other side of the aisle that I really just find incredulous. I mean, if we want to have the head in sand approach and pretend that obesity is not a problem, or know that it's a problem, but have this sort of visceral reaction to government doing anything about anything, then I think we're really just frankly kidding ourselves. There can be no substitute for the family. There can be no substitute for parents. The government is not in it to substitute. But I think that government, the panel of professionals and people doing this report can help guide us. You know, I'm a father of 3. My kids are grown now. Any help that I could get, I would take. And what responsible parent wouldn't do it? So rather than being attacked for a government intrusion or other such nonsense, we should be saying thank you, because I think your report helps all of us as parents and all of us as a country. Obesity is a problem that we can't ignore, and we need engagement from all sides. Of course, responsible parenting, as well as industry participation and government participation. I mean, working together, maybe we can get at this problem. We have directed FDA and FTC and CDC and USDA to come up with these proposals, and I think that the proposal you've all come up with is a reasonable response that all parties should be able to support. It's a voluntary proposal, and it meets the industry more than halfway, and it's a positive step forward as we all work together. Now, let's look at some statistics. Obesity costs the country $147 billion per year in direct medical costs, which is over 9% of all medical spending. And economists have calculated that the total economic cost of the obesity epidemic is $270 billion per year. Kids would just have one of the testimonies here before, I think it was Dr. Post, talked about kids drinking Kool-Aid or whatever it is. They don't eat fruit. They don't drink things. And this is something that we have perpetuated on these kids. I want to just ask you about industry self-regulation. I'm told that the percentage of unhealthy TV food advertisements has decreased significantly since industry tried to self-regulate in 2006. Is that true? Is it not true? How is the industry self-regulation working, in your opinion?
There was a recent paper which indicated that the products advertised by adherents to CFEI decreased by about 10%, but were replaced by an increase in fast food restaurant advertising. I would describe that as a modest change.
Right. Well, I think that shows that we still have a lot of work to do, and that if we can use some common sense approaches, which is what you are doing with these voluntary guidelines, I think it's very important. Mr. Waxman before raised tobacco. I mean, I've been in this Congress long enough to remember when the tobacco industry sat right in front of us and told us that tobacco was not something that was, had an injury, that tobacco was just fine. And the industry, resented it and resisted for years and years. I mean, we now have stamped on cigarettes that tobacco kills, yet people buy tobacco and smoke them. I mean, we're not talking about a panel that intrudes into people's lives and tells them what they can or cannot do. We're talking about a report that helps us understand the problem and helps us to take steps as a country to ameliorate the problem. So I just want to thank you, and unless you have anything else to add, I'll yield back my time, because I think that it's so unfair for people to portray this as obtrusive big government. It's just nonsense. This is something that Congress directed you to do. I think it's a guideline. As a parent, I'd want to have this guideline, And I listened to all your testimony, and I just want to thank you for the good work you're doing. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shemkus, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And sorry I missed your opening testimony. I had to go to the Rules Committee on another bill, so obviously I've had a good opportunity to evaluate your opening statements, along with was involved with the letter sent by members to kind of raise issues of concern based upon the Senate language that asked for you all to do that. I guess the first question is, you all were asked through the language in the bill or to actually do a report back. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what we received, so Mr. Vladeck says, and what we have seen is guidelines being offered, which for us has a concern that we don't have the full report. We just had a submission or the proposed guidelines. Now, to my good friend from New York State and the city, our concern is that when these guidelines are not voluntary, they will be, in essence, the force of law. And if I look at the top 100 most commonly consumed foods, beef burgers, I just had one for lunch. I'm not a child anymore. Beef burger, hamburger, 95% lean, one patty cooked, and bun, doesn't make it. Bottled water, non-carbonated. Bottled water, doesn't make it. Eggs scrambled made with added fat and salt, doesn't make it. Hot cereal, a leading instant oatmeal raisin prepared with water, does not make it. Leaf salad, iceberg, lettuce chopped with salad dressing, light ranch, doesn't make the list. It doesn't make it because of the dressing, the sodium in the dressing. That's our problem with big government. That's the problem with, when I go home, my constituents are saying government's too big, it costs too much, get out of things that really has no constitutional right to be delving in. The ability of parents to adequately take care of their kids, feed them what the parents would like the kids to be fed, the nutritional issues. To have big government do this is really bizarre. I mean, and so I'm glad we've had this hearing today. And I guess the question is, we already talked about it. We would like to see the science based before guidelines, a true analysis of this. But let me go to a question for Director Vladeck. Can you comment on the role taken by FTC during the interagency working group process related to appropriate nutritional levels? What did you all do?
Well, our expertise is more in the marketing side than the nutrition side.
Exactly.
Though I think it's important to note, Congressman, that many of the foods that you mentioned as somehow being excluded by the draft guidelines, I don't believe that is correct. I think that Dr. Post would love a minute to just sort of clear up the record on this.
Well, what we can do, we can have you submit additional comments for the record. Let me go on, continue on this line of questioning to Mr. Vladeck. Did FTC make any judgments or issue specific recommendations on this topic informally or formally during the interagency working group? The question is, what has the FTC done on, if you question my analysis of the food groups based upon what did the FTC, I don't want to know what Dr. Post did, I want to know the FTC's involvement in the health analysis of these foods. And is that a role that you have any expertise in?
This is not our area of expertise, no. We were certainly at the table, but I think it's fair to say the nutrition guidelines, principally the product of the expert agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Yeah, and here's an FTC member questioning the USDA on their nutritional standards. So you all are questioning the USDA, who should have the expertise on nutritional aspects. Our concern is you're playing the role of food analysis when you should be in advertising and the like. And I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Yields to the ranking member emeritus, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes for questions.
Like everybody in this room, I'm troubled about children's nutrition, but the process by which we arrive at good standards is a matter of great importance to me. I note that in 2009, the working group was, and I quote, directed to conduct a study and develop recommendations for standards for the marketing of food when such marketing targets children who are 17 years old or younger. Now, that was not done. I find myself curious because here you're coming forward with guidelines. Congress has suggested that you should tell us what is going on. You have not done so. We find that this gives us real problems in terms of understanding what it is to be done or should be done, and we have to think that you, despite the fact that you're hired full-time to work on these matters, will be having equal difficulty. Now, according to your testimony, the guidelines you released in April are not based on any new studies conducted by the working group's agencies. Is that correct? Yes or no? Yes or no?
We did.
I've got a lot of time. Yes or no?
No new study.
No new studies. And the guidelines you developed were directed at industry and not a report to Congress. Is that correct?
Excuse me? No.
Okay. Now, you note in your testimony that the working group recommendations, quote, will cover all the most important aspects of children's marketing without being unduly restrictive. Did the working group weigh any cost benefits that the recommendations would have on industry? Yes or no? Either Mr. Vladeck or Mr. Dietz. You may proceed.
Not in the way you're describing it, no.
Okay. Now, does industry agree on this? Yes or no?
More or less.
Okay. Now, you note in your testimony that FTC has long been an advocate for strong and meaningful self-regulation. I happen to agree with that, and I happen to have been a strong supporter of that. In the instance of food marketing, industry has been self-regulating marketing to children to ensure that foods advertised are healthier since 2006. And this is to Mr. Vladeck, do you believe that the industry's self-regulation of food marketing to children has helped to ensure the products advertised to children and their parents are healthier? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as you know, the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative recently released recommendations to improve nutritional standards of food marketed to children that member companies must meet by December 31, 2013. Do you believe that these recommendations will help to improve the nutritional content of products advertised to children? Yes or no? Again, Mr. Vladeck.
Yes.
Have you consulted with industry, and do you have their comments or agreement? Yes or no?
We've had lots of comments from industry, yes.
Now, do you believe that these recommendations will help encourage development of healthier foods for children? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, will the working group take into consideration the set of nutrition principles set forth in the initiative before finalizing its own guidelines? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to focus for a moment on breakfast cereal. This is a major product of my home state of Michigan, and the science regarding the relationship between cereal consumption and body weights. Specifically, I note that several studies appearing in the journal of the American Dietetic Association, including a study conducted by the NIH's National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, established that children who eat cereal frequently are less likely to be overweight than those who eat it less frequently. The result was obtained for all age ranges, but to take example from one of the studies, kids 7 to 9 who eat cereal 8 or more times per 14 days are 3 times less likely to be overweight than kids who eat cereal 0 to 3 servings per cereal in a 14-day period. In fact, dietary guidelines recommended eating nutrient-dense breakfast and have suggested that not eating breakfast is associated with excess body weight, especially among children and adolescents. Eating breakfast has also been associated with weight loss and weight loss maintenance. Shouldn't we perhaps be encouraging kids to eat more cereal as a part of a healthy breakfast instead of a less amount of this, as the preliminary proposal would do? Yes or no?
Our proposal doesn't
I'll take
discourage
Mr. Vladeck on that.
No. We
Now,
support
like all members of this committee and the witnesses before us, I believe strongly we must address the rising issue of children obesity in this country. It is costly for health and future success of the country, and it's costly to our health system. So as we work to address this issue, though, we must ensure that the actions and guidelines proposed by the federal governments do not negatively impact business, industry, and job creation. One more question. I know I'm beyond my time, Mr. Chairman, but I'm curious. How do you assure us that these voluntary guidelines will not become engrafted into the law as a statement of government policy or something which will achieve a mandatory impact upon industry?
We have issued.
How are we to assure that some lawsuit or some good lawyer at some future time is not going to say, "Oh, these guidelines say this, and therefore these people have done a significant hurt, have committed a tort, and this class action is going to be decided against them"?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Pardon?
Were you finished? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'm more than finished. I'm over my time by a minute 21 seconds. But
you may respond if you wish.
Yeah, there's this myth that somehow voluntary guidelines will be the foundation of litigation brought against the food companies. We have not ever seen any evidence of that kind of litigation being brought. We issue voluntary guidelines on a number of topics, including 7 reports to Congress on media violence that suggest all sorts of industry self-regulatory proposals. Industry has adopted them to some extent, but not completely. We've never seen litigation on that. The Supreme Court recently relied heavily on our self-regulatory proposals in Brown versus Merchant Education Enterprises. This was the video violence case that the court resolved last term, cited extensively to our research on this issue, and talked about the industry compliance. Some parts of the industry comply, some do not. It's never been the trigger of litigation.
Thank you. Chair thanks gentlemen and yields to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And some of the concerns that we have when we have these kind of situations, I was at a rock quarry on Monday, and a federal prosecutor went to a rock quarry because their garbage can was overflowing. And in the whole criteria of safety in the section that the inspector looked at, part of it was, are you having workers in high altitudes not strapped? And the other one is, can you close the lid on the garbage can? So that's where you get to that we just got to make sure that we have reasonableness in what's going forward. And I just took the same sheet, I don't know if y'all have that or not, that Mr. Shimkus was showing, and to Mr. Post, and I kind of came up with a day's meal for my kids, and asked if this would meet the 2021. If I start out with scrambled eggs, sweet toast with jam, and then 2% milk. And then for lunch, when they went to school, I had a turkey sandwich on wheat toast with vanilla yogurt, low fat, and either bottled water or 2% milk. And then for dinner, we had a light salad with light ranch, chicken breast, corn, green beans. I did put in a roll, and bottled water or 2% milk. Would any of that meal fit the guidelines of the 2021 criteria?
Well, yes, it would. We, in fact, went through considerable effort to conduct a study. We reviewed and incorporated findings from numerous studies. We looked at IOM reports. We looked at the dietary guidelines. And then we did testing. We did our homework and did testing of our proposed thresholds. To test the feasibility of the April 28th preliminary proposed criteria, we analyzed foods commonly advertised to kids, to children, and we are concerned that parents continue to depend on the foods that they've learned that are the more healthful choices. We found that many products in the various product lines meet the April 28th proposed principles, including tuna, peanut butter, flavored low-fat milk, orange juice, oat cereals, instant oatmeal, popcorn, baked chips, salted peanuts, yes, salted peanuts, whole wheat bread, and even fast food meals. Water was never excluded. Canned vegetables, we've heard about that as well, that are lower in added sodium would certainly meet the criteria, although it's doubtful that many are advertised to kids. But we did our homework, and we do have the information to know that there are foods that are eligible for advertising.
Well, I don't know if y'all have this list or not. It shows meets 2021 target criteria, the same one Mr. Shimkus had, and the one, everything I just mentioned didn't. It says bottled water, non-carb, bottled water, doesn't meet the guidelines, less than 50% of a food group. Chicken breast, if I can find it on here. But anyway, none of those, according to this analysis, meets that criteria. And I know you can prepare things differently. You can, if you fry an egg, you can do it differently than if you scramble an egg, and you can add sodium if you salt. But it just seems that, as I looked at this list, I'm concerned about childhood obesity. I mean, if anybody wants to do something to really open their eyes, tour a dialysis place and see what people are doing when they're older and they're obese and it happens to get diabetes. It really opens your eyes. But as you start looking through things that according to this analysis, all family cereal, all leading family ready-to-eat cereal, no sodium added sugar, lasagna, no saturated fat, sodium. I mean, just different things that are on this criteria. It just seems like it's not just the M&Ms that Congresswoman Blackburn talked about, and getting a couple M&Ms so you eat the healthy stuff. It seemed like a whole list of things that most American parents would say, I'm giving my kid a turkey sandwich on wheat bread and giving them vanilla low-fat yogurt. It's because the vanilla flavoring, I think, is what doesn't meet, but it's low-fat, doesn't meet the guidelines. I mean, that's when I look through that, it says, well, we're spending a lot of time on stuff that, go ahead, forward. It's almost like the guy getting cited for his garbage can being full.
If I can respond, we were focused on foods that are marketed to kids. I think the list you have are foods that are consumed, not necessarily the same foods that we considered. Beer and coffee are on that list. We wouldn't consider that as foods marketed to children. So it is a matter of looking at what we did, and that is the foods that are commonly advertised.
But even if these aren't marketed to children, somebody's putting these guidelines saying that that's not a recommended 2021 target, meets the guidelines for a healthy meal. I mean, whether it's marketed to a child or not, because I try to find a turkey sandwich when I'm traveling around for the purpose of being healthy, and I'm about out of time. But you see what I'm saying? I mean, you start going through these guidelines, you say it just seems to be, it's not about certain foods that we would all look at and say, well, maybe that's too much for a kid to be eating, whatever. I'm not going to bring all those up. But you look through this 2021, it doesn't meet the target. It just kind of opens your eyes of, well, I'll let you finish. I guess I'm about out of time. But
just as the last response, we are looking to industry and changing the nature of the foods out there, obviously, and we know through the CFBAI effort, there's a great effort there. So we are looking forward to the work that proposes is occurring over the next couple of years. So we know we can get more healthful choices out there.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and yields to the ranking member of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I'm kind of following up on what Mr. Guthrie said. I don't mean to be repetitive, but I wanted to ask. The Grocers Manufacturing Association says that the working group recommended nutrition standards that are arbitrary, have no basis in scientific evidence, and conflict with federal dietary guidance and nutrition policy. And then they go on to say that under the working group's recommendations, and I quote, whole wheat bread, breakfast cereals, reduced fat yogurt, canned vegetables, and bottled water could not be promoted for consumption by children. I just wanted to start with Dr. Post to comment on that, if you would. Is it really true that your report recommends against marketing to children whole wheat bread or reduced fat yogurt and these other listed foods that they talk about?
Well, in the work that we did, in the study that we did, in what we reviewed and incorporated, we did look at the numerous studies that are already out there on the issue. We did, in fact, exhaustively go through the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee Comprehensive Nutrition Research Report. we looked at the dietary guidelines exhaustively as well. And we considered regulations that are promulgated by FDA and USDA governing nutrient content claims and health claims and food labeling. We looked at relevant IOM reports and industry groups and various public and private entities standards that are out there. We know that that there are foods, because we did our homework and we did what we called food runs. We did our analyses to know that foods like whole wheat bread and orange juice and oat cereals and popcorn, and I mentioned salted peanuts, will in fact pass the thresholds that were established for the preliminary recommendations. And we know too now with the CFDAI effort that there are foods that can in fact be advertised, although some work is needed, as that organization understands or as reported, to continue to reformulate is a necessity. But for the most part, yeah, there are foods out there. So the assertion is incorrect. There are foods that can be advertised.
All right. And Dr. Dietz or Mr. Vladeck, did you want to comment on that at all? No? Okay. I think it's important that, the standards that you recommend to Congress have to remain aimed at promoting healthy children, but they have to be achievable, or otherwise the industry is just going to ignore them. And they also have to set clear targets that will lead to improved nutritional quality of the foods that are marketed to children. You mentioned the IOM. Some today are saying that we don't have enough science to justify these guidelines for marketing foods to kids, and the IOM did in fact say there's no clear causal relationship between advertising and body fat levels of kids in their report, I guess, in 2006. Now, I know none of you served on that IOM panel, but can someone help me understand why the working group, recommends changes in marketing foods to kids, given, that the IOM is saying there is no clear causal relationship? What's your response to that?
I'm not sure whether you were here for my opening comments.
I wasn't. I had to go to rules. Sorry.
There's the caloric imbalance necessary to reverse obesity is pretty small. It's about 30 calories for young children, 2 to 5-year-olds, and about 150 calories for 6 to 11-year-olds. Our belief is that modest reformulation or modest reductions in the caloric content of foods commonly consumed by children could achieve that deficit. Not a single food, but across the board. And we also know that there's a direct relationship between television viewing and obesity in children that seems to be mediated by the consumption of foods advertised on television. So there seems to be this linkage between television advertising, consumption of foods advertised on television, and obesity. Despite the conclusions of the IOM panel, it's worth examining a little more carefully what the studies were that they looked at. They reviewed about 65 studies. About 75% of those studies, some of which were cross-sectional, so you can't really demonstrate causality from those, but about 75% of those studies found an association between food marketing and obesity in children. But the more important studies, in my view, are the intervention studies that have shown that reductions in television time are associated with reductions in weight without a concomitant increase in physical activity, pointing to that connection between television viewing and obesity in children.
So there may not be a direct or clear causal relationship, but it's still something that,
Admittedly circumstantial.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us today. I tell you, it's a very interesting conversation that we're having here this morning. One of the things that I'd like to ask is, let's go back in time, if we can. I know that on page 3 of Mr. Vladeck's testimony, you have that the Institute of Medicine has strong evidence that TV ads influences food and beverage purchases and requests for kids under the age of 12. When these studies were being done, did you go back and check what happened with advertising 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago? Because I'm just kind of curious, because I grew up in the late 50s and early 60s when I was a kid. Now, granted, we got 2 channels on a good day when I was a kid, black and white, and some days they came in, some days they didn't come in. But Saturday mornings was my favorite day of the week because that's when all the cartoons are on. Plus, that's when all the cereal commercials are on, okay? And, I'm thinking back to a lot of, the kids that I went to school with, that we didn't have an obesity problem, but I tell you what, we ate so much, what we consider junk food today, but it's kind of a difference in time. But what I'd like to, and also if you go back into the late 30s and 40s, I'm always interested in listening to old recordings of old advertising and some of the things, how they used to advertise the kids at that time. Of course, they're sitting at a radio, staring at a radio. Nothing was happening except sound coming out. But we've had advertising going on for decades, specifically to children, but it seems like only recently that we've had this obesity problem really starting. And I guess the question I'd ask is this, is that Mr. Barton, or Chairman Emeritus Barton, I think was right on point when he was talking about, families and sitting down and eating meals and preparation. And I tell you, when I came home as a kid from school, if my sister and I got home and we said, gee, is there something to eat? My mom would actually make oatmeal. We'd eat cabbage hearts, carrots, apples, and all these other things. But it also, we had this great fear. When I was a kid, if our parents ever saw us in the house, I don't care if you were at your friend's house, that if you were sitting, that must mean you had time to do more work. I don't care if it was schoolwork or housework or yard work, so we took off. But, are there studies out there to go back and look what was advertised 40, 50, 60 years ago and how that affected kids when you did the study?
We're about the same age, and I remember Saturday mornings fondly as well. Of course, in those days, there wasn't very much fast food. There wasn't much prepared food. Most of the meals my mom worked, but she cooked dinner from scratch every night. I don't know whether they're the kinds of long-term studies that you're describing. We will take a look, and we're happy to get back to you on that. Maybe one of my colleagues does, but I'm not aware of the kind of analytic work that you're doing.
If there are studies from back then, I'd be very interested to see if somebody went back and looked at that, especially with obesity rates.
Just to add to that, to bring on the issue of complexity, we know the food environment is so much more complex, and the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is a whole chapter now for the 2010 Dietary Guidelines that recognize how complex the food environment has become, that it's not simply a household influence anymore. There's so many other influences.
Well, and also, if I may, just throw this out, because I know in Mr. Dietz's testimony on page 6, when he going through about that of more than $200 billion dollars for children and youth collectively spend annually, ages 8 to 12. I didn't have any money when I was a kid unless I'd shoveled some of these driveway or modes. So the money I got came from my parents somehow. So it's really a question, I think, also today is that where these kids are getting the money, who's buying the TVs, who's buying the computers, what's the parents. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we all know, the parents plop their kids in front of the TV set, put a snack in front of them, and voila, instant, you don't have instant food, you got an instant babysitter. So, a lot of it, I think, falls back on where the parents are. And I know when, I think Mr. Dietz made the comment in regards to, the kids nag their parents, and I told both my girls a long time ago that I want to always remember there's a difference here, that I was their dad, not their best friend, and they had to figure out there was a big difference between the two. But I'd really be interested if we could find out if studies have been conducted in the past, especially in the 40s and 40 or 50 years ago, when in the infancy of television, when those commercials were really out there. But the obesity from then to today I'd like to really get that analysis. And I see my time is up, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the time. Thank you very much for being here.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm really pleased that we are able to have today two subcommittees coming together to discuss what is such an important topic, and I appreciate the testimony of the three presenters so far. I'm pleased that we're here today to discuss the partnership that has in the past, and I hope will continue to exist between private industry and public health professionals to address the marketing of less healthy food to children, that being our goal. but I worry that we're losing sight of the reason we are having this discussion at all. And your testimony, Dr. Dietz, clearly makes that point. About 1/3 of our nation's kids are overweight or obese, affecting not only their physical and emotional health, but also the fiscal health of their families and of our nation. Specifically, Dr. Dietz, you note that the direct costs of childhood obesity are at least $3 billion a year. And this health condition, it's an epidemic, really, and the high costs often continue into adulthood. In light of these numbers, it is clear to me that the obesity epidemic necessitates an equally strong response. As a former school nurse, that's my background, protecting the health and well-being of our children is one of my greatest concerns. However, the potential benefits of these voluntary guidelines on our national health care expenditures is also an important factor that I believe these guidelines could themselves address. So, Dr. Dietz, would you take a minute or two to explain more to us on the record about the cost of the obesity epidemic to our healthcare system?
As you point out, the costs in childhood are about $3 billion a year. This was a recent study published in about 2009 by Leo Tresande. That's trivial compared to the costs of obesity in adults, which somebody else mentioned earlier is about $147 billion.
And isn't it true that obesity in adults almost always starts some point in childhood?
The majority of obesity in adults, at least historically, has started in adulthood. The childhood obesity has contributed a minor portion of that obesity, but what's a concern about childhood obesity that persists into adulthood is that it accounts for a disproportionate share of severe obesity in adulthood, and therefore may contribute disproportionately to the costs of obesity in adulthood.
So, in terms of other costs?
Well, the costs that have been estimated in the paper that we published that cited the $147 billion, that was the cost associated with obesity, which also accounted for the cost of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and the hospitalizations and medications associated with all of the associated, all the diseases associated with obesity.
And so Medicare, Medicaid, private insurers are shelling out more money.
Well, a big concern is about half those costs are borne by Medicare and Medicaid.
And this is not to mention the additional indirect costs from decreased productivity and absenteeism from school. So there are some ripple effects as well into the rest of society. Like most chronic health conditions, I'm convinced that primary prevention, doing all we can to stop obesity before it ever starts, is key to addressing these concerns. And I want now to turn to Mr. Vladeck. As you may know, a different take on this topic. In 2003, the IOM issued a report on the marketing of alcohol to kids. A similar kind of questioning came from my colleague, Mr. Pallone. But with respect to the comparison with alcohol, IOM concluded, like in the case we're discussing today, that there was no clear causal link between marketing alcohol and the use of it by kids, but still recommended limitations on alcohol marketing to kids. There are, of course, differences between alcohol and food. But a few years later, in 2008, at the close of the Bush administration, the FTC issued a report. Mr. Vladeck, the industry was engaged in self-regulation at that time. They said the IOM report was not based on strong science. What did the FTC do in that 2008 report?
We encouraged self-regulation. And these are difficult areas for us. We do not have, particularly in the food area, rulemaking authority that would permit us to regulate in these areas. And there are, as you know, there are First Amendment issues that would arise if we tried to regulate aggressive marketing. We have, through enforcement efforts, such as our recent case against Fusion, taken action against marketers who are marketing to children. One of the counts in the Fusion complaint was a count alleging that Fusion, which is the seller of Four Loko, which is an alcohol product, used images plainly of kids, people under the legal age, in order to promote alcohol.
Right. I know I'm going over time now. But I would, saying that there are differences between alcohol and food, there also is a close parallel for how the agencies provided a framework when voluntary industry-based efforts were not adequately addressing a vital public health problem. There isn't anything extreme about this document on marketing food to kids. It may not be perfect, but I believe it's clearly the next sensible step to take. And in closing, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit testimony submitted by Mars. For the record, I believe this document may have identified areas that I hope we can use to form a common ground. And I yield that.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady, and the gentlelady's unanimous consent request to include in the hearing record statement of Mars. I also have 4 other items: a letter to HHS, FTC, Department of Agriculture, and CDCP from members of Congress led by Eric Paulson of Minnesota from October 11, 2011, statement from the American Bakers Association, testimony from the President and CEO of American Frozen Food Institute, and a statement of the American Frozen Food Institute to the FTC. Without objection, both sides have seen these. Without objection, these will be included in the record. And now the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. And you know, as I look at this, and Dr. Dietz, and your opening statement and remarks, and looking at your report, you know, you have a statement here that says not only does obesity increase the likelihood of a child developing those serious physical issues, you also said, but it also may lead to severe psychological and social problems such as absenteeism from school, discrimination, victimization, and poor self-esteem. So I just wonder what you're doing here for the skinny kids like me. You know, when I was 6'5" and 160 pounds. Now I got a little, you know, I added a little. By the time I got married, I was 165. So you know, I did beef up some during that time. But you know, when you're a skinny kid, particularly going into young adulthood, and you have to have a suit. Back in that day, you had 2 choices: you could get navy blue or really dark navy blue. I mean, that was pretty much your choice. So as you look at this, you know, every child is different, but it appears that your report is focusing more on obesity, and I understand the physical reasons for that. But tell me exactly what was the charge or the task that was giving the IWG? What was the verbiage for that?
I'll just jump to the directive. The working group is directed to conduct a study and develop recommendations for standards for the marketing of food when such marketing targets children who are 17 years or younger, or when such food represents a significant component of the diets of children. In developing such standards, the working group is directed to consider positive and negative contributions of nutrients, ingredients, and food, including calories, portion size, saturated fat, trans fat, sodium, added sugars, and the presence of nutrients, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains to the diets of children. And secondly, evidence concerning the role of consumption of nutrients, ingredients, and foods in preventing or promoting the development of obesity among such children. You want?
Sure, that's fine. Now, you know, one of the proposals, and I want to make sure I've got this right, one of the proposals is it would eliminate sports figures and also animals from boxes. That is correct on what the recommendation is?
There, in our proposed draft, there's a discussion about that. Okay. As I tried to signal in my written testimony and in my oral statement today, my sense is that we're moving away from that.
Okay. And would it be your personal recommendation that you move away from that?
Yes.
And what about you, Dr. Post?
We're in agreement, yes.
Okay. Dr. Dietz? Okay. Well, that's, you know, as we look at the correlation you were talking about, Mr. Vladeck, about television and obesity, each of you have, you know, heard this. You know, is the obesity connection for television because of the advertising or the sheer number of hours that a child will sit in front of the television to watch?
Well, certainly inactivity is a contributor, and as time has gone on, we've been more and more concerned about screen time because it's not limited to television time. The data we have, though, is about television time and the advertising on television and the connection that that has to the consumption of foods advertised on television while watching television.
So if it is related to the advertising of the food product, and you're saying that the child who is a child is the one who sets the standard for what the parent will buy at the store and not the parent?
Well, not always, but children have a huge influence on parental decision-making, and that is derived from the advertising that directs children to want products.
Well, we've all seen it or experienced. Certainly in aisle 6, the child pitches a fit, and it's easier to give in and put it in the basket than it is to be the parent and maybe not shop in the store with the child. So what is the average number of hours that your study shows that the typical child will spend watching television?
We have not done a recent study of that. My recollection is that on average it's 3 hours. It's variable by age. But I think on average, and there are significant ethnic disparities. African American children tend to watch more television.
Okay. Anybody else have different figures besides the 3 hours that you've heard or familiar with? Okay. And during that, let's say a typical 3-hour period that a child is watching TV, they're inactive, obviously,
Yes.
during that time. During that 3-hour period, how many advertisements would typically be about a food item?
I think the majority of ads, and I can't remember. FTC has those numbers. I want to say 11, but I think that Saturday morning is quite different than weekday.
I think the average is somewhat lower than that, outside of the cartoon hours on Saturday morning.
And I know my time's up, but it sure seems like we're trying to do these, and I know we have many things, many regulations that are well intended, and we certainly want people to be, and kids to be healthy. But it seems to me that we're trying to do what the parent is supposed to be doing here, to have the responsibility for that self-discipline of the family and to do those things that need to be done. And so we're in a situation where this doesn't mean that we all want to see an end to childhood obesity, but this seems to be a far-fetched approach when what we should be doing is expecting the parents to do their job. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman and yields to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Towns, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on Mrs. Capp's question. Is it true that the IWG agencies do not have regulatory authority over food advertising to children?
I think it would be very difficult for the Federal Trade Commission to issue regulations that had any binding effect in terms of marketing food to children. Our rulemaking authority is very limited in this area. We have enforcement authority, but it wouldn't extend to the kinds of issues that we're talking about today.
Right. Could you give me an example of your enforcement authority? It's the classic one, you know.
Our authority is deception. It rests on a company committing a deceptive act or an unfair act. But here, the only example I could come up with would be if a company were making completely unsubstantiated claims about the beneficial health effects, selling lard covered in fat and making claims that this is going to improve your heart health or something like that. But our authority here, our regulatory authority and our enforcement authority is pretty limited. And even if it were not, regulating in this kind of area might raise First Amendment issues. And so one of the points that we've tried to make repeatedly is there is nothing that isn't voluntary about the proposal. If industry decides not to adhere to it, then we've spent a lot of time and we haven't accomplished very much. But it is up to industry ultimately to decide whether it's going to abide by these standards.
Why does the companies feel that that it's not truly voluntary, and why do they feel that way?
I don't know. If you look at, we've been doing this sort of work for quite some time. For example, we have, I think, submitted 7 reports to Congress making recommendations about media violence. The fact of the matter is that the industry, I think, has welcomed our role here, but some of the industry complies, some of it doesn't. We've never brought a case because not abiding by these standards doesn't fit the deception theories that we can rely on. The Supreme Court discussed our voluntary approach at length in a recent Supreme Court case involving violent video games sold to children. So there's a long track record of the FTC engaged in this kind of voluntary self-regulatory guidance without any coercion from our part, without any enforcement from our part, without any collateral litigation being brought by third parties. So I am mystified by that claim.
Yeah. You know, they're saying that these rules and regulations will bring about a job loss. I mean, what are your views on that?
Well, there is one study which we find perplexing because it assumes that as a result of our voluntary standards, industry will stop advertising to children altogether, and the loss to the economy will be $2 billion, which greatly exceeds the amount of advertising directly to children that we found in our most recent study. And that study goes on to conclude that there will be substantial job loss. We've had our economists look at the study. There are no citations in the study, so we don't know where these figures come from. But the figures don't match the industry's own data about how much it spends in advertising to children. So we do not understand that study, and we certainly don't agree that a voluntary self-regulatory proposal is going to have that kind of consequence on the economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes for questions.
I thank the Chair. I'd like to welcome the witnesses again and thank you for your time and expertise today. And my first question is going to be for you, Dr. Post. As I mentioned in my opening statement, hundreds of jobs in the district I represent and thousands in my home state of Texas involve the manufacture, sale, distribution, marketing of snack products, including wholesome and nutritious products. These products qualify as healthy under the FDA regulations and are eligible under the Healthier U.S. School Challenge, a federal nutrition program. I'm referring to products like Sun Chips, Baked Lay's Potato Crisps, and Baked Cheetos snacks. And yet, the IWG draft proposal would deem them unacceptable. And to make things more confusing, hope we'll sign here. My staff has told me that classic hummus, right here, is sold under the Sabre label, is not restricted, but green olive hummus, sold on the same label, is restricted. Why is green olive hummus a threat to children's health and not classic hummus? Help me understand why there's such a disconnect between these federal agencies.
Well, as I had mentioned earlier, we did in fact do analyses of food composition, the products that are commonly out there in the world of advertising. And in our findings, products like the whole wheat bread and the other products, even the baked chips that you had there, would in fact be permissible and allowable under our structure. Some products, because of higher sodium contents, would fail. I mean, I imagine olives as a source of an ingredient in a food would be a problem. We were interested in following the dietary guidelines, and in that regard, we were looking for reductions in sodium, saturated fat, certainly sugars as well. And so in some cases, the threshold couldn't be achieved. But there are certainly a lot of products that would be viable out there for marketing.
I know, sir. With all due respect, we're talking about a lot of marketing. And look at the packages. Exactly the same except for 3 words here. Greek olive hummus, classic hummus. Now, again, I appreciate what you're talking about, some of the sodium and what olives might add, but the fact is we're here talking about advertising. Those 2 products look the same to a kid, to an adult. And I think we've got to be careful here because, again, we can't – the responsibility ultimately rests with parents. And that, to me, in my mind, is not some sort of danger to children's health. I mean, no child is going to look at that different packaging and say, Mom, I want that one because it's classic, or Mom, I want that one because it's olives. Question for you, Dr. Vladeck. I'm troubled by your testimony today. In response to a question from my colleague, Mr. Shimkus from Illinois, regarding the FTC's role in recommending specific nutritional standards in the IWG process, you said that the Commission should and did defer to USDA's judgment given their subject matter expertise on nutritional standards. Yet, in a July 15, 2010 memo written at your request by attorneys in the Division of Advertising Practices at FTC, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to put this memo in the record. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to put this memo in the record.
So ordered.
Thank you, sir. Employees at the FTC expressed strong disagreement with the nutritional standards recommended by the USDA. In the memo, attorneys at your commission delve into inherently scientific questions about nutrition, such as proper thresholds for sodium intake and the associated risks related to blood pressure in children. Commission employees also expressed concern with the saturated and trans fat levels recommended by USDA. This memo seems to contradict your assertion to Mr. Shimkus just a few minutes ago that FTC did not involve itself in nutritional aspects of the working group process. I find your juxtaposition of this letter and your statements troubling. Can you explain your assertion and this seemingly contradictory fact? I've got a copy of the memo if you need it, sir.
I'm aware of this memo. I think the thrust of this memo is that we were worried, and there were many drafts. As you know, this process is, we're in our second year of this process, and we're not done. But what we were concerned about was one of the interim USDA proposals may have cut back on industry's own self-regulatory efforts. If you look at page 3, what we were concerned about is that there was a USDA proposal that might actually be weaker than some of the industry self-regulatory guidelines. And that was a cause of concern to us. I would note that this is an internal US FTC memo. I'm not sure that this was shared with anyone other than within the FTC. And this is simply a memo to me suggesting that there may be concerns about the IWG process if we're going to undercut industry's own self-regulatory efforts.
I appreciate it, sir. Beginning with your testimony, Mr. Shimkus, you said the FD, you defer to USDA's judgment about subject matter expertise on these nutritional standards.
USDA, FTC, and CDC. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Again, I don't believe this is a proper role for the FTC, and it looks like I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman. Yield back.
All right, Chair, thanks. Gentlemen, recognize, just a minute. You have a problem with this? All right, we will reconsider unanimous consent request if you want to take some more time to look at that. All right, you want to yield to Mr. Terry for 15 seconds? All right, we'll recognize the gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All I want to do is ask unanimous consent that I may place a statement into the record.
Without objection? He wants a unanimous consent request for a statement in the record. Mr. Terry. So ordered. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Gentlemen, I'm a physician. I am totally aware of this issue and very much concerned, and thank you for your input. My questions are not to challenge. My questions are to understand. Dr. Post, what a great name for a guy from USDA talking about childhood nutrition, huh? I see that the state of New York and other states had a proposal that would not allow sugar-sweetened beverages to be purchased in the SNAP program. USDA would not allow this restriction, saying there is no proof that decreasing sugar consumption would decrease the health in SNAP beneficiaries. Man, that just seems very kind of counter to the whole thrust of this discussion. Any comments on that?
That's an issue that's obviously very deeply being dealt with in the Food and Nutrition Service, our sister agency, and I haven't been part of the discussion regarding the SNAP program.
I see that there's a correlation, at least in some studies, between SNAP participation and obesity. And in fact, I'm wondering if there was a regression analysis, some sort of statistical analysis that said, okay, what is the relative role of participation in SNAP versus the relative role of Tony the Tiger? And so I say that. because I've read that there is a boom and bust type cycle with SNAP programs, that people get their SNAP benefits once monthly, they purchase a lot of goods, and then they get them again the next month. You cannot purchase vegetables and fruit to keep them for the whole month. We are effectively saying go out and buy high-caloric stuff at stores. Do we really know that we have met the enemy, and the enemy is SNAP?
A response to that is that we aren't aware of any evidence, convincing evidence that establishes SNAP participants or participants of other food nutrition assistance programs as the cause of overweight or obesity.
You mean there is stronger evidence that kids watching commercials on Saturday morning are more likely to be obese than the SNAP program, which encourages the consumption? Because I've seen evidence that people on SNAP don't buy more fruits and vegetables, but they do buy more calorie-dense foods.
Well, with regard to the evidence on nutrition assistance programs, including SNAP, the evidence that exists is in fact mixed. And that while some studies have shown an association between participation in certain of these programs and higher weight for some groups of participants, others have found no association. So none have in fact shown a causal relationship.
And so you saying that, you're emphasizing causal relationship. Again, have we seen a causal relationship between advertising to children and not just an association, but causal association between advertising to children and increased obesity?
Well, I will defer to CDC, but I will say that there's certainly a contributing factor there, perhaps not a causal relationship, but
No.
certainly a contributing factor.
There's a difference between a causal and just being associated. Dr. Dietz?
The whole debate about causality of obesity is complicated. And I tend to focus more on what can be done about obesity than emphasizing another longitudinal study trying to control for all the factors which affect it. And what we do know about obesity is that one of the most powerful interventions is reductions in television time.
Now, you say that, but I was wondering, we don't necessarily know that reductions in TV are not associated. Is that a secular thing, or does it actually influence other things?
These are randomized clinical trials.
So if you have somebody who is watching more TV, is she or he more likely to be in an area which is a food desert, an area in which the built environment is less conducive to getting out and walking, or in families which have more children and perhaps mom is using TV to babysit?
Yeah, those are sound questions. I don't think we know the relationship of television viewing to food deserts, for example. We do know that there's a relationship between television viewing and neighborhood safety. That parents
now, that in itself, because my wife will not let my children bicycle on our busy street.
Right.
So clearly built environment figures. Do we really not, as I was listening, I kept on thinking, man, I bet you TV watching correlates with lack of an appropriate environment for a child to exercise without mama's supervision.
There have been some studies that confirm that. I don't think it accounts for all the television viewing that's going on.
I accept that, but on the other hand, we're making a case for these rules based upon something which may have an alternative explanation. Is that a fair statement?
Well, first, these are not rules. They're voluntary.
I'm sorry, you're right.
Proposals.
I apologize.
And you're right. I think we still need more data on factors that affect obesity and, most importantly, on how to resolve it.
Again, gentlemen, I'm not saying all this to challenge, but rather to understand better. Thank you for your participation. I yield back.
Chair thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the Vice Chairman of the Health Subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And can we just continue on that concept for a moment, both Dr. Post and Dr. Dietz? It does seem like the focus now is regulating the end product. Have we sufficiently studied the issue of lack of access to healthy foods? And I know in part of the district that I represent, I'm dealing with the problem of food deserts, and it seems like that is a more appropriate place to start, the access to healthy foods, rather than some of the voluntary guidelines that are being talked about this morning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's true that food deserts are a significant problem that impair the intake of a healthful diet. We were not asked to look at the impact of food deserts on food intake. We were asked to look at the effect of food marketing.
But I'm not mean to interrupt, but you still, in your testimony, you talk about the disproportionate impact on minorities and lower socioeconomic status. And in certainly the areas that I'm thinking about at home, I mean, your only option for nutrition is a convenience store. And I mean, not being derogatory to convenience stores, I use them all the time myself. But if that's your only option, it's tough to get a head of lettuce when all you've got is a Twinkie display. You know what I mean?
No question about it.
Well, again, I would just ask the question, would we be better focusing our efforts in a time of limited budgets? Should we try to fix that problem first before we go into this direction?
Well, I think those efforts are underway. And as I said earlier, I think we need a multi-component, multi-sectoral approach. There's, as you, I'm sure, are aware, there is the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, which has allocated substantial sums of money for the development of grocery stores and other retail changes in food deserts or areas with limited access to food. I think that's an important step forward. Unfortunately, we don't know what the impact of that intervention will be on obesity rates.
Let me, I guess, Dr. Dietz, let me stay with you. I mean, you referenced a moment ago in your discussion with Dr. Cassidy that the causality of childhood obesity is complicated and multifactorial and multifaceted, and I may have added some words there to your discussion. But nevertheless, it's a complicated issue. So do you have available, and can you provide us, has the CDC compiled a compendium of articles and data collections on the scientific basis for the conclusion that banning food advertising will promote public health? Well, what is the precise scientific basis for the conclusions of the working group that banning food advertising will promote public health?
First of all, we're not talking about banning food advertising. We're talking about modifying. Sorry.
Your microphone, please.
Sorry. We're not talking about banning food advertising. We're talking about modifying food advertising directed to children.
Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, some people would say your modification results in a ban. But, okay, fair enough. But you were really not even asked to provide guidelines, but you kind of did, didn't you?
Well, we were very careful not to call them guidelines. What we called them were principles.
Look, we don't call income-relating means testing, but everybody knows that it is. So were these guidelines or not?
No. I think they were principles.
Very well. On the principles, then, that you developed, can you provide us with the precise scientific basis for the conclusions detailing those principles?
Yes, I think Rob reviewed the data sets that we analyzed.
And I apologize for not being here, but perhaps if the CDC has that available, I know you guys compile a lot of data, maybe you'd be able to do that for us.
We've referenced those studies in our testimony. I think all three of us have done so. But if you'd like additional information, we'd be happy to provide it.
I think that would be helpful to the overall direction of where this committee is going. And you know, again, I just like Dr. Cassidy, I'm not trying to be confrontational. We appreciate all of you making time to be available to us here in the committee this morning. But at the same time, these are issues that have significant impact and import. And I appreciate the fact that there is work being done on providing for areas with food deserts. But I got to tell you, I'm not seeing the results. I'm not seeing the activity. So if the CDC is doing that, I'm grateful, and I welcome your participation, but in some parts of the world it's not happening. And the difficulty is these are parts of the world that are otherwise affluent. The surrounding communities, you would drive through and say, nothing to see here, let's keep moving. But the reality is you've got pockets of poverty within these relative areas of affluence that are significant, and they've, of course, been hurt harder by the recession than the surrounding communities. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess this will go to all three, but Director Vladeck first and Dr. Post second. In a fiscal climate where every dollar is precious, we do have to be focused on protecting jobs, and we have to be focused on our economy. That's where the real concern is right now. But it appears that the IWG has completely disregarded, any attempt to find out an economic impact that any kind of a ban or suggestion or whatever would have on this. The reality is the food and beverage industry employs 1.4 million workers, 12% of our manufacturing workforce, and it's one of the biggest sources of manufacturing jobs. Now, you said you didn't consider the economic benefits or the economic impact or benefits when creating these guidelines. Is that true, that there were no economic benefits taken into account?
We did solicit questions in our comments, and we expected, if there were economic objections, to get them in our comments. That was not the focus.
So you got 0 comments of anybody that was concerned about the economic impact?
No, I'm not saying that. We did submitted a study, which we gave to our economists to take a look at. The study purported to be based on advertising expenses for ads geared at children.
Right.
And the economic analysis posited that if our voluntary guidelines, principles were adopted by industry, it would essentially end all advertising to children, costing about $2 billion in expenditures a year.
And specifically, what about jobs?
I think it concluded ultimately that there would be a loss of 74,000 jobs. Our concern is that we have many concerns, one of which is there's no underlying data. There's no citations to any of the assertions made in the study. But more problematic, it assumes that advertising to kids will stop, and it uses a figure for advertising expenditures that greatly exceed what industry tells us it is spending.
So your study, your study says 74,000 jobs it costs, but you don't have a basis, so it's probably not actually the case.
It's not our study.
There was a study that you've seen that we're talking about.
You asked about. I mentioned the comments. I was explaining that in connection with the comments, this study was submitted. But more importantly, as I tried to make clear before, industry itself has proposed quite substantial changes in its own self-regulatory proposal, bringing it very close to where we're likely to end up.
Right.
Industry is not proposing making these changes if it thinks it's going to cost it money, revenue, or jobs.
Right.
And so, I understand your concern about.
But yeah, it's a big concern. I mean, you got a lot of people that want jobs out there, and when you talk about killing jobs from the government perspective, that's not a good way to get on the right train of creating jobs.
We agree.
I appreciate that.
But voluntary standards don't kill jobs.
Let me ask another one. You contend that these restrictions are voluntary, but some of the most distinguished scholars of the Constitution argue that these would violate the First Amendment, these voluntary proposals. Do you believe the food and beverage industries will treat these restrictions or principles or mild hints or gentle reminders? Do you believe they'll consider them rules? They'll count them as rules? I mean, do you think that they will?
I don't. They're not enforceable in any respect. And
so
that's why
but if they're not going to be, if they're not rules and they're not enforceable, then why even go through the trouble of creating them in the first place?
Well, because Congress told us to issue.
Well, we also wanted a report, right, that we're still waiting on?
That is correct.
Do you expect that any time within the next few whatever that we're going to see the report that we actually requested?
We're hoping to get you a report by the end of this year.
Okay, so we were able to get some of the guidelines out, but the report will hold
the guideline
by the end of the year.
The report will constitute what we're calling principles, guidelines. I think they're
gentle suggestions may be the new words.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you. And
thank you.
All right. The gentleman yields back. Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your time today. It's been a long morning for you all. It started with Mr. Waxman saying he was mystified by the fact that we're holding this hearing. That's maybe one of the first things I've agreed with Mr. Waxman on in my 9 months in Congress. I'm mystified, too. I'm mystified that the federal government believes that it can identify a problem, childhood obesity, and I think everyone here has agreed that there's a challenge, there's a health risk, but thinks that the federal government's got a solution, and that we can get so detailed and we can spend hours talking about these things, and that the federal government can solve this problem with a set of principles out in the air. I'm deeply troubled by that fact. I know you would use the defense of Congress made me do it, but I will tell you that was a previous Congress, and I hope this one will reconsider that. Having said that, Mr. Vladeck, I want to talk to you about your notion of voluntary. You continue to say that the industry came up with a set of principles that are very close to where you're going to be. Don't you think that's at least in part because they're afraid of you?
I assume it's because they think it's the right thing to do.
Right. Because they're afraid that the federal government's going to come put a more onerous set of restrictions on them, and it is often the case that industry will respond by trying to move close enough that they can convince regulators like you that they have been good citizens. So it may well not be the profit motive that drove him, but the fear of regulation that drove them to do it.
I would disagree. We have voluntary standards, for example, for media media violence, violent video games, movies. Industry has adhered to some and has not adhered at all to others. We have no enforcement role in that space. The voluntary principles that we articulated were done pursuant to a congressional mandate, just like the congressional mandate here. No one has suggested they have a coercive effect. I think one of the things that we need to look at is
until just this moment, I suppose.
I'm sorry?
I just suggested that, so one person has.
I apologize. I didn't mean to put it that way. I was talking about the media. I understand that you suggested. But two other quick points. One is this is an area in which we have very limited regulatory authority. So the idea that we could turn around tomorrow and take these principles and codify them in a binding, in a binding regulation, there's no basis for that concern. Even though, I know Kathleen Sullivan, I know Marty Reddish, the First Amendment scholars. I've litigated in this area extensively. I've argued commercial speech cases before the Supreme Court. I know this area of law. It takes a law, a statute, a regulation, or some other practice that has the force of law to create a restraint or to create coercion, and it's not there.
I appreciate that. Would you commit today to filing a friend of the court brief in defense of the industry if someone should choose to sue on this matter, saying that the principles we put forth provide no basis for it on behalf of the FTC?
I don't have that discretion on my own, but
would you recommend to the FTC that they would do that?
I will commit to putting something, if we can persuade our colleague agencies, to say that in the final report that this is not intended to create binding legal standards and should not be the basis of
I appreciate that.
Something along those lines, which should signal quite clearly our view that industry has no legal obligation to follow.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. I have just a question for all three of you, and then I'll be complete. Have we seen any examples in other countries where this type of principle or guideline has been effective at changing behavior and improving health conditions in children?
I'm sorry, I don't have any of that data at my fingertips.
And we're aware that other countries have these kinds of voluntary standards, or organizations in other countries do. Whether they're successful on their own, no. This is a complex issue.
Yeah.
So it's part of the puzzle.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Murphy. 5 minutes for questions.
Morning, gentlemen. I'm all the way over here. Good to be with you. Just a little back. I'm also a psychologist. I've dealt a lot with obese kids over the years and maintain a faculty appointment with the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine in pediatrics. So I appreciate your concerns about youth here. I'm thinking as I'm hearing all this, I don't know how we survive, because a typical menu some of you may have had may have been similar to mine. I can still recall that we'd have meatloaf, fish sticks, canned vegetables, canned fruit cocktails, fried chicken, Campbell's tomato soup, and that wonderful thing that cures all ills, that Velveeta sandwich on white bread. I don't know how we survived. And yet CDC has this great map on your website which shows obesity rates changing over time. It seems to me there's some big differences here, and I just want to make sure as you prepare some reports on this that you're looking at the full breadth of what I think is making a huge difference here. I'm also noting that as these guidelines on marketing come by, I'm looking at this website here that has some things in there which sounds like it may be one of those things I just want to make sure we're not going after in terms of attacks. Do you know what tag-alongs are? Anybody know what those are? Tag-alongs? They're Girl Scout cookies, my favorite. Now, the serving size, unfortunately, is 2, and I think most kids would say I'd rather have 8 or 10 or 12. And I'm concerned. I want to make sure we're not going to attack those poor Girl Scouts who are on the box covers there with that as well, because the issue here, I want to make sure we're broadening this. And Dr. Deese, I think you brought it up about the television time. And I think you would agree it's not television. It's what they're doing instead of television. That years ago, it was not just what we ate, but what we did when we were not eating. Perhaps some of you also grew up in an era where your parents told you in the morning, get out of the house, play all day. If you come in here, I'm going to put a vacuum cleaner in your hand. You're going to wash windows. You're going to do something else. So kids were very active, and now they're not. what I am concerned about here in guidelines coming forth, and I'm doing this more as recommendations than I want your comments, is are any of you familiar with the Naperville School District? Their program is pretty exemplary, and one which I hope at some time we can even bring someone in to talk about that from the school district. They actually spend less per student in expenses than some other school districts in Illinois, but they require an hour of vigorous activity, elevated heart rate every day. And in turn, these students actually exceed many other countries, and many other Asian countries, on trends in international mathematics and science study, reading tests, etc. And obesity rates, whereas nationwide is what, we're approaching about 30% nationwide obesity rate. They're at like 3%.
3% in children.
Yeah. How much is it in children?
17%.
17% in children. But they have 97% of eighth graders turn out very bright, and a very small percentage of them have obesity rates. So as you're talking about these guidelines and as we're looking at marketing, I would like to know what your thoughts are in terms of the big culprit here is also immobility, lack of activity, dealing with thumb movements on gaming or dealing with clicking things on an internet. It's not activity. But I'd like you to comment on marketing of those issues, too, as a key ingredient of burning off calories and getting healthy nutrition. Could each one of you go through that, starting with you, Dr. Deese?
I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of activity and equally importantly the contributions of inactivity. And certainly physical activity is a strategy to be encouraged, not only because it helps weight control, but also because it reduces the comorbidities associated with obesity. And I've known about Naperville for a long time, and it is a model. I've worried that it's confounded by income and socioeconomic status and perhaps other factors. I'd love to know whether kids walk to school in Naperville, because they don't in most parts of the country. And we've certainly eliminated physical activity as part of a child's daily behavior and life.
Got to hurry. I just got a few seconds, but I want to hear from each person.
Okay.
So, next, Dr.
I think
your microphone.
I think this comes back to this being a very complex issue. We are totally supportive of ensuring that we empower people with information, kids in schools, where we learn, where we play, where we get fitness, certainly in healthcare settings. So I think we can look at all the solutions being part of this multi-sectoral effort. And certainly advertising is one way we can deal with this, but certainly enhancing school meals, and there are a lot of other opportunities that are working in parallel.
Dr. Vladeck?
Yeah, we agree. This is a complex issue, and physical activity is one important step in the right direction.
Well, I would venture to say I think it's a critical importance. It's not something that should be a postscript to this, but one that I think is absolutely central. And I think we're going down the wrong road of going after advertising with regard to food if we're not doing other things. One of the companies in my district is Dick's Sporting Goods. I venture to say they do more to reduce childhood obesity than some of these other things to deal with some advertising and some foods will be doing. So I hope that is something you all include in your report right up front. It is extremely important, and this is something I hope this committee takes into account in the future too, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. The ranking member have a unanimous consent request.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record an open letter on the First Amendment and the interagency working group principles. This is from various constitutional law professors around the country, and I believe you have it.
We have it without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
That concludes the questioning for our first panel. And Chair thanks the witnesses for your testimony, for your responses. And we will dismiss the first panel and call the second panel to the witness table. While the staff is setting up the table, we'll suspend for 5 minutes. Subcommittees will come to order, and I will introduce the second panel at this time. Our second panel consists of 7 witnesses. Our first witness is Jim Bauman, Senior Marketing Counsel for the Campbell Soup Company. Next is Dan Jaffe, Executive Vice President for the Association of National Advertisers. Our third witness is Elaine Kolish, Vice President and Director of the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative. Our fourth witness is Beth Johnson, Principal and Founder of Food Directions. Next, we will hear from Margot Wooten, the Director of Nutrition Policy at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. We also have Dale Kunkel, a Professor of Communication from the University of Arizona. And finally, Dr. John Irons, Research and Policy Director at the Economic Policy Institute. Thank you all for coming. We have your prepared statements. They will be entered into the written record. We ask that you summarize in 5 minutes your opening statement. Mr. Bauman, you're recognized to summarize your testimony. Turn on your mic. Yeah, push.
Is that better?
Light. There you go.
Okay, thanks. Again, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Pallone. My name is Jim Bachman. I'm Senior Marketing Counsel for Campbell Soup Company, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about just some of the concerns we have with the Interagency Working Group's proposal to define marketing to children and to adolescents, and then to lay out the nutrition criteria for products that are promoted in ways that meet those definitions. Our biggest concern is that the proposal loses sight of what we believe is the national priority on which we should be focusing, childhood obesity. Cracking obesity is the key to diet-related conditions such as heart disease and diabetes. As the only corporation in America having an executive devoted to childhood hunger and obesity, we are fully committed to that priority. By taking their eye off obesity, the agencies have proposed criteria that, for example, not only fail to address calories, but would discourage the promotion of soup, a food associated with managing weight. But why are the agencies discouraging people from eating a food that isn't related to obesity? The essential reason is that the agencies have been focused on idealized foods rather than on foods parents will actually include in the family meal plan. Moms look for foods that kids will eat and parents will enjoy too. And yes, there are men and women in every food company who roll up their sleeves and figure out how to make actual foods that taste really good, have a pleasing texture, that's not just a kid's concern, that won't spoil as soon as you get them home, won't cost an arm and a leg, and will provide good nutrition. The problem is that the IWG nutrition criteria are simply not realistic when it comes to making great-tasting food. For example, while calling for more whole grain content than can readily be put in baked products for kids, they call for reducing the very things that help kids find whole grain products good to eat. A little salt and sugar to help with texture and to reduce that little bit of a bitter taste that kids can find objectionable. It's all in the power of definition. Advocacy organizations have been telling you, and anyone who will listen, that practically all we make and sell are unhealthy foods. But healthy and unhealthy have to be defined. When Campbell calls something healthy, we follow the FDA and USDA requirements for using that term. For example, we only market healthy soups and healthy canned pasta to kids. The IWG proposal uses definitions that are in fact inconsistent with the government standards. For example, when it comes to sodium, they impose a requirement that foods contain about 1/4 the level that is in the healthy definition, an amount in foods that are already not enjoyed by everyone. To produce foods to definitions that are even less tolerant of salt and sugar and fat would discourage people from eating the healthy foods they're now enjoying, and it would discourage food makers from even trying. We're told that we should not complain about the agency's proposal because it is voluntary and just a suggestion. That's not how it feels from here. These 4 agencies are the agencies that regulate our business, that have the power to shut us down, that look hard at everything we do and say. They are not advisors to the food industry. What they say in their official capacities matters. If adopted, these so-called voluntary principles will certainly evolve in that definition, in that dimension. Even now, Senator Tom Harkin has introduced legislation laying the groundwork to make them binding in S-174. We are all impatient to see some results in our national struggle with childhood obesity. In that impatience, it is important to not put obstacles in the path of helping real people and real families eat better. Creating nutrition standards and marketing definitions that would put what we decide to call healthy food out of the reach of most people's taste buds and wallets will not help us eat better and manage our weight as a nation. It is a different kind of leadership we need from our government. Leadership in partnering with stakeholders to educate the nation and how to eat and live in a way that will better promote our health. And leadership in promoting scientific research to better understand what practical tools may help reverse the incidence of childhood obesity. Thank you.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Recognize Mr. Jaffe for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I would very much like to thank Chairwoman Bono Mack, Chairman Pitts, Congressman Pallone, and the other members of the two subcommittees for this opportunity.
Is your red light on? Is the red light on? Or green?
Should I start again?
Yeah. Okay. So that's good.
Bring it in
Thank
closer.
You.
All right. I will try to do it. So again, I would like to thank Chairwoman Bono Mack, Chairman Pitts, Congressman Pallone, and the other members of the subcommittees for this opportunity to testify. I am Dan Jaffe, Executive Vice President of the Association of National Advertisers, and our membership includes 400 companies with 10,000 brands that collectively spend over $250 billion in marketing and advertising annually in the U.S. ANA strongly opposes the proposed IWG guidelines. These are unprecedented, extreme proposals with far-reaching implications for individual companies and our nation's economy. The IWG's proposed guidelines defy common sense and are inconsistent with other federal nutrition standards. They are not well-founded or likely to reduce childhood obesity. You've heard a great deal about childhood obesity throughout this hearing, but there is no words in the report that you have received, in the preliminary report, that in any way discusses how the various proposals, if followed, would have an impact on obesity. These guidelines need to be formally withdrawn and returned to the drawing board. The IWG, in effect, is attempting to re-engineer the American diet by declaring war on many healthy products, including whole wheat bread, 2% milk, cereals, yogurt, oatmeal, and literally thousands of other healthy products. Again, you've heard this questioned, but when we have had this study by our experts and then talked to our company members, they all confirm that this is the truth. Of the 100 most popular foods consumed in America, only 12 could be advertised under the IWG standards. And you say, well, that's your claim, but the IWG in its own report on page 5 admits that, quote, a large percentage of food products currently in the marketplace would not meet the IWG principles, which I think really answers the question pretty definitively when they admit that they are wiping out most products in the marketplace. The federal government seems to be suffering from a severe split personality when it comes to nutrition standards. The IWG proposals are dramatically inconsistent with other federal nutrition standards. They do not match the standards set forth in the school lunch program. They do not match the Department of Agriculture's dietary guidelines issued just last year. They do not match the WIC, Women, Infants, and Children's program. This defies common sense. Foods that meet the federal government's stringent criteria for being labeled healthy, both by the USDA and by the FDA, should be advertised more. But the IWG says they should not be advertised at all. In his executive order issued in January, the President required federal agencies to consider the costs and benefits of any regulation. It does not appear that the IWG involved here have ever considered these impacts. Lost jobs and lost sales are certainly likely outcomes of the proposal. The noted economic firm IHS Global Insight analyzed the IWG proposal using a macroeconomic model developed, and I emphasize this, by Nobel laureate in economics Dr. Lawrence Klein. They estimate that the guidelines, if acceded to, could drive down food and beverage advertising expenditures substantially. These reduced expenditures would result, they claim, in a decrease in total annual sales of $28.3 billion and elimination of 74,000 jobs. This has already been argued about in this hearing, and we will hear from another witness questioning that. But the facts are that there's nothing in the report on the costs or benefits. So how is the Congress going to determine who is telling the truth and who is stating things that are not accurate? The IWG proposal is a veritable sword of Damocles hanging over the head of industry while avoiding the requirements of cost-benefit analysis that any sweeping proposal such as this should require. Two of our country's leading constitutional scholars, Professors Martin Reddish, Northwestern University Law School, and Kathleen Sullivan, former dean of the Stanford University Law School, analyzed the IWG proposals and found to be a thinly disguised attempt at backdoor regulation. The four agencies were specifically directed to conduct a study and make recommendations to Congress concerning nutrition standards and their impact on childhood obesity. So far, the IWG has produced no study, and instead of reporting to Congress, it issued a specific, highly technical performance mandate with an implementation timetable. Worst of all, there is absolutely no proof or discussion about how the massive changes called for in the proposal, which would cost multi-billions of dollars just in reformulations, would have any direct impact on reducing childhood obesity rates if they were all carried out. We believe it is critical that before any final report is issued by the IWG, that the Congress demand at the very least two key things: a complete cost-benefit analysis and a specific demonstration of how any proposed changes will directly impact childhood obesity rates. This is what the Congress called on the IWG to do and what they still have not even attempted to provide. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today.
Chair, thank the gentleman and recognize Ms. Kolish for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. I'm delighted to be able to participate today, and I'd like to make 3 points. First, self-regulation through the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative is steadily improving the foods and child-directed advertising. Our participants, 17 of the nation's leading food companies, represent the vast majority of child-directed advertising. By using meaningful nutrition criteria, they have shifted the emphasis of their advertising to children, to foods that are substantially lower in total calories, lower in fats, salt, and added sugars, and higher in nutrient content, just as the Institute of Medicine recommended in its 2006 report on food marketing. Indeed, many of the foods advertised to children today meet the FDA's definition of healthy foods. The companies have accomplished these product improvements by devoting vast amounts of time and by spending millions and millions of dollars. As a result, kids watching children's television programming regularly see ads for foods such as apples or applesauce or other fruits, milk, yogurt, and veggies, either as a part of a canned pasta dish or as part of a meal. And now, more than ever, products are including whole grains or larger amounts of whole grains. And I'd like to say in response to Mr. Waxman's concern, it's also important to know that major candy companies, Mars, Hershey, Cadbury's, have agreed to stop advertising to kids under self-regulation. And our participant Nestle has agreed to stop advertising its Wonka and other confections to kids as well. Second, the CFBAI's new, groundbreaking, category-specific uniform nutrition criteria will further improve the foods and child-directed advertising and make self-regulation work even better. Our new criteria build on the successes from our current program, in which companies use meaningful but individually based standards. Our new uniform criteria will replace the company standards by the end of 2013. After that date, products across companies will meet the same criteria for the relevant product category. Our process for developing the new criteria was informed by the experience of high-level in-house nutrition professionals who, on a daily basis, work on the development of new products and recipe changes. As a result, we had the benefit of their food technology and food science experience, as well as their understanding of the barriers to consumer acceptance of changes to popular products and newly developed products. In developing the criteria, we also were sensitive to competitive issues, and the criteria are purposely flexible to encourage even greater participation in self-regulation and to promote competition in the marketplace. The new criteria take into account the inherent differences in food product categories. A one-size-fits-all approach simply does not work. Grain products and dairy products, for example, are different, and they need to be treated differently. Accordingly, we set limits for calories, fat, trans fat, sodium, and sugars, and requirements for positive nutrients such as fruits and whole grains that are appropriate to each category to spur product improvement and innovation. And our new criteria are tough. They will require the participants to change almost 1/3 of the products they currently advertise to children, products that already meet meaningful nutrition standards if they wish to continue advertising them after these criteria go into effect. Third, the interagency working group proposal was not realistic or workable. It inappropriately would have swept in advertising to moms and families, and its proposed nutritional criteria greatly underestimated the technological and consumer acceptance barriers to reformulating well-liked products. Our new criteria, in contrast, provide a rigorous yet realistic roadmap for future improvements. Our new criteria also are well within the scope of what the IWG said it was seeking as an alternative to its own proposal. Our new criteria are based on or closely aligned with regulations defining healthy products and disclosure levels, just as the IWG suggested. They also are informed by IOM's recommendations for school meals and other foods sold in schools. In conclusion, we were delighted to learn that the IWG considers our new criteria a significant development and that it intends to take them into account in its report to Congress. That's good news. Self-regulation has accomplished a significant amount in just a few short years. It's changed not only what products are advertised to kids, but the expectations about what should or should not be advertised to kids. So our new criteria will continue the steady improvements already occurring in foods advertised to kids and result in self-regulation working even better. Thank you so much.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and recognize Ms. Johnson for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Pitts, Madam Chair Bono-Mack, Mr. Pallone, and Mr. Butterfield, and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Beth Johnson. I'm a dietitian, a mother of 2 girls, 8 and 11, and have worked in the food policy world for almost 20 years. I'm pleased to be speaking to you today on behalf of the American Beverage Association, Food Marketing Institute, Grocery Manufacturers Association, the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, National Grocers Association, National Restaurant Association, and the North American Millers Association. I want to start with what most of us agree on. There is an obesity problem in the United States. How to address the problem, though, has been a question for as long as I've been working in the area of food policy. Some ideas that the government is wisely engaged in, as is the private sector, are backed by clear evidence, like community interventions or school interventions we talked about earlier. Others, like food marketing, are less clear in their causal evidence. To that end, Congress directed the Interagency Working Group to conduct a study of the issue and report its findings and recommendations to Congress. Among other issues, Congress directed the IWG to consider calories. Instead of conducting a study, it appears the IWG did a literature review and proceeded directly to proposing comprehensive food marketing restrictions that contradict established nutrition science, ban the marketing of many healthy products to our children, and impact thousands of food and farm jobs. Interestingly, even though the effort was clearly about obesity, and the agencies have long-standing positions on the importance of calorie balance on obesity, the calorie portion of the report is, at a minimum, very confusing, if even there. What the restrictions would do, however, is add to the confusion that's already out there on nutrition. Once fully implemented, the proposal would restrict the marketing of most whole grain breads, not all, yogurts, even though those foods provide important nutrients like fiber and calcium. Many cereals, too, would be prohibited from advertising because of sodium and or sugar, both of which are far lower today than in the past. Some would argue that many children's cereals are high in sugar and shouldn't be advertised. But sugar levels have come down significantly and now represent a mere 5% of daily sugar intake and only 4% of calories. Cereal provides significant levels of important vitamins and minerals and is a vehicle for about 40% of milk consumption. Numerous government studies show that kids who eat cereal for breakfast have lower BMIs and do better in school. As a dietitian and a mom, I think that's a pretty good track record. Equally as troubling is the lack of consistency within the federal government. Recently, the Department of Agriculture updated the WIC food package based on recommendations by the Institute of Medicine. Certain foods, like yogurt and cereal, have been determined by nutrition experts to be important enough to supplement children's up to 5 diets through the WIC program. Yet most of these same foods couldn't be advertised according to the IWG. The IWG criteria also don't match FDA's definition of healthy. At a minimum, this is very confusing and adds to the confusion that Americans are already facing today about nutrition. To be clear, the industry supports finding innovative ways to address the obesity challenge. In the past few years, the industry has reformulated over 20,000 product choices to reduce calories, sugar, sodium, and other ingredients. These changes have occurred with significant research and resources to ensure safety, quality, and consumer satisfaction. Kids aren't fooled that easily. If it doesn't taste good, they won't eat it. And preventing the advertising of foods won't make healthier foods taste better. In addition to reformulation, the industry has listened to concerns about marketing to children. As a result of Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, all marketing to children by CFBAI participants is for nutritious foods that meet science-based standards. Let me note that critics dispute some of the results as far as the lowering of advertisements for food and beverages, but that's because their standards, they've based their analysis on different standards. Finally, the question of costs and benefits must be addressed. A recent study by Georgetown Economic Services concluded that IWG's proposed restrictions, if fully implemented, would have a significant and negative impact on the U.S. economy, in part because of the costs of the IWG-compliant foods are much higher than healthy foods in the diet. Indeed, if we ate the way the IWG would like us to eat, we'd be spending 60% more on our food than we do today. There would be other implications across the economy as well. But despite 2 recent executive orders which require government proposals to take into account benefits and costs and to be based on best available science, the IWG has not done a cost-benefit analysis. We urge the administration to withdraw the food marketing restrictions proposed by the IWG. Instead, we urge the IWG to do as Congress directed and conduct a study. Additionally, we urge them to follow the President's direction and look at the benefits and costs of this proposal. Obesity needs attention, but none of us can afford to waste limited government resources. Thank you for the opportunity.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Recognize Dr. Wooten for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm Margot Wooten, the Director of Nutrition Policy at the Center for Science and the Public Interest. I know that I'm supposed to say that I'm happy to be here, but actually I'm quite concerned about the focus of this hearing and the food, advertising, and entertainment industry's aggressive lobbying to prevent the interagency working group from providing even voluntary suggestions for how they might improve upon self-regulation of food marketing to kids. You've heard about some of the progress that has resulted from the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, and we support self-regulation and have successfully urged many companies to join the CFBAI. But after 5 years of self-regulation, progress is very modest and insufficient given the huge effect that childhood obesity is having on our children and children's current diets. From the time before self-regulation was in place until after, the percentage of food ads that are for unhealthy foods has decreased only a little bit, from about 90% of food ads to 80%. Recently, the CFBAI announced a common set of nutrition standards for food marketing to children, and that's a positive step forward. But it's only a baby step. Unlike the interagency working group, the industry standards were developed through a closed-door process with no opportunity for parents, the public, and public health experts to provide input. Under the CFBAI's so-called groundbreaking new standards, Cocoa Puffs, some varieties of Kool-Aid, fake fruit snacks, sugary popsicles, and many other foods that nutrition professionals consider to be unhealthy are considered healthy by the industry. I worked with Senators Brownback and Harkin on the bipartisan provision that required the formation of the interagency work group, and I know firsthand that the intent was not to supplant self-regulation, but simply to strengthen it. The interagency working group guidelines would simply be suggestions for how companies could strengthen their food marketing policies to make them more effective. In fact, The CDC, USDA, and FDA lack regulatory authority over food advertising to children, and Congress itself took away this authority from the FTC in 1980. The interagency working group's proposed guidelines are based on science and what's best for children. Those recommendations have overwhelming support from health groups and researchers and from the public. Out of the 29,000 comments that the agencies received, over 28,000 of them are in full support of the proposals by the agencies. The industry's proposed its own new marketing guidelines that are what business wants. As much as we support the original IWG proposal, we know that there'll be a compromise somewhere in between. Unfortunately for children and families, industry doesn't even want a compromise. They want Congress to step in and kill the interagency work group. Few deny that childhood obesity and poor diets are national health concerns. We all agree on that. And of course, there are multiple contributors to children's poor diets and obesity. But food marketing plays a key role. Industry representatives have been arguing that food marketing isn't effective. But if marketing doesn't work, why are companies concerned about these voluntary standards, and why do they spend almost $2 billion a year marketing to children? Marketing is effective. Studies show it. Companies and parents know it. The reason that marketing has a negative effect on children's diets and health is that the overwhelming majority of products marketed to children are still of poor nutritional value. Now, of course, parents bear much of the responsibility for feeding their children healthfully, but parents are outgunned by industry that has psychologists, market researchers, great music, cartoon characters, and other sophisticated marketing techniques at its disposal. Parents' job is hard enough. Companies should support parents by not encouraging our children to desire and to expect to be fed food that undermines their diets and health. In closing, I ask you to let the interagency work group finish its work. And I urge the food, entertainment, and advertising industries to work with the interagency working group, not against it. The IWG is simply providing companies with much-needed advice on how they could continue to strengthen self-regulation. Then it'll be up to the companies to decide what to do next. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady, and the ranking member has a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Olson from Texas requested unanimous consent to submit an FTC document into the record during the questioning of the first panel. I just wanted to note a few things about this document. There was no signature on it, no timestamp, no evidence that this was a final document. My staff has asked for the origin of the document, and we've not heard anything yet. And without further information, this isn't even an internal memo. It's a draft of an internal memo from staff to their chairman. I'm not really sure why the majority would want to enter it into the record. However, in the interests of full transparency, the FTC has no objection to entering it into the record, and therefore I have no objection either. But in doing so, I just want to make it clear that I don't believe the document merits a great deal of attention from the committee. And with that, I would withdraw my objection.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. Without objection, it will be entered into the record. And Dr. Kunkel, welcome.
Let me start by asking, why are we here today? Based upon much of the discussion so far, one might surmise it's to argue about where to draw the line in terms of defining foods as healthy, or maybe to debate the proper role of government in people's lives. While both of those issues may be central to what we've discussed today, the fundamental reason why we are here is that the nation faces a staggering epidemic of childhood obesity and, contrary to assertions we've heard from some, there is compelling evidence that food marketing to children contributes significantly to the crisis. There are many elements involved with the obesity epidemic. Fewer family meals, increased reliance on fast foods, less physical activity, and a host of other elements all contribute to the problem. But we now know with great confidence that children's exposure to advertising for unhealthy foods stands prominently among the factors that contribute to childhood obesity. That evidence-based conclusion should remain front and center in the discussion about the fate of the IWG guidelines. In 2005, I served on an Institute of Medicine panel that produced this report, which has been referenced quite a bit today. More than a dozen of the nation's leading scientists in nutrition, child development, marketing, and media effects systematically reviewed every scientific study that's been conducted on the topic, reaching back more than a quarter century. Among our key findings that were unanimously reported, 1, children are heavily exposed to food advertising. 2, the vast majority of child-targeted food ads promote obesogenic products that are high in added fat, salt, and sugar. 3, child-targeted food advertising is highly effective. And 4, children who see more food advertising have a significantly higher risk of succumbing to obesity. Based upon that overall body of evidence, the IOM report concluded that food and beverage marketing practices put children's health at risk. It's well known that the IOM report had several recommendations. One was that food marketers should shift their children's product portfolios to healthier foods, and 2 is that they should similarly shift their advertising practices. But the IOM issued yet another key recommendation that has largely been overlooked, and I want to draw your attention to that today. It explicitly recommended that if voluntary efforts fail to shift advertising during children's television to healthy foods, Congress should enact legislation mandating that shift on both broadcast and cable television. That report was released more than 5 years ago. That's when the IOM rang the bell that this is a problem that is harming our nation's children's health. That's certainly been ample time for the industry to respond effectively. What we haven't heard anything about today is what does the evidence say regarding how well industry self-regulation is achieving the goal of shifting child-targeted food advertising to healthy foods. So on this point, I have some evidence that, in fact, the evidence across a number of studies is strong and consistent. The large majority of child-targeted food ads still promote unhealthy products that should not be part of a regular diet. Prior to the advent of self-regulation, my research shows that 84% of all foods advertised on TV to children were for products in the poorest of 3 nutritional categories used by DHHS, and that consists mostly of highly sugared cereals, beverages, snacks, and fast foods. If self-regulation was achieving its goal perfectly, the percentage of foods that fall in that category now should come down from 84% to 0. If self-regulation was even moderately effective, that proportion should at least be below 50%. But my studies show that in 2007, following self-regulation, the proportion of foods marketed to children that remained unhealthy was 79%, and in 2009, it was still at 72%. I will soon release some findings from research I've conducted this year that indicate more of this pattern of inching in tiny steps in the desired direction while falling very far short of the actual goal. In sum, industry self-regulation has not yet achieved any meaningful improvement in the nutritional quality of the foods marketed to children, and at the current rate of reform, my data indicate it will take until the year 2033 for self-regulation to eliminate all child-targeted advertising for foods in the poorest nutritional category, all of which are products that should not be part of a child's regular diet. But instead of pursuing the regulation that the IOM report recommends, this committee has called a hearing that questions the mere recommendations that industry should be more responsible in their billion-dollar campaigns to influence children's eating patterns. It seems to me that this committee has lost sight of the fundamental cause for concern in this realm, that the marketing of unhealthy foods to children contributes to the epidemic of childhood obesity.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and now recognizes Dr. Irons for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today about this very important topic. My name is John Irons. I am the Research Director at the Economic Policy Institute. My organization, the Economic Policy Institute, has been a leading non-governmental voice emphasizing the need for more jobs in this weak economy. As an economist, I am very concerned about the impact of high and prolonged levels of unemployment on families and on the long-term health of the economy. With the current economic weakness in the labor market, it is important to assess the economic and employment effects of the voluntary marketing guidelines that are the subject of today's hearing. Let me briefly outline the prime impact of the proposed guidelines on employment. In my view, to the extent that companies follow these guidelines, the impact would be primarily a shift in advertising and a shift in product sales, not necessarily a reduction overall in these industries. First, to restate the obvious, the IWG proposed guidelines are voluntary, and thus there is no automatic reduction in advertising as a result of these guidelines. Second, if companies do choose to adopt the voluntary guidelines, a primary change that would result is a shift in consumption across food categories. For example, from foods with high levels of fats, sodium, and sugars towards foods lower in these nutrients. This shift in either advertising dollars or in sales could occur across product lines within a single firm or across firms within the industry. There might not be a net reduction in advertising, in sales, or employment even within the industry. It is also possible that advertising dollars would be shifted from marketing to children towards advertising on other products or advertising on the same products to other people, such as their parents. Over time, we can expect firms in the industry to respond to the guidelines by establishing new, healthier products and product lines that could then be marketed to kids. In fact, a surge in advertising might result as companies seek to expand product recognition for new product lines amongst kids and their parents. For example, as the FDA was considering adopting regulations to require trans fat labeling, many companies reformulated their products to remove trans fats and invested in marketing those products. For example, Frito-Lay, back in 2003, had an ad campaign that was placed in top 25 newspapers around the country announcing 0 grams of trans fat for their products that they had recently reformulated. Further, industry advertising is often designed to compete with other brands, transferring market share across companies, but resulting in little to no change in their final industry-level sales. A report by IHS Consulting has been cited widely, including in this hearing today, that claims to show that guidelines could result in a 20% reduction in ad sales and a loss of 74,000 jobs. My submitted testimony includes a more detailed critique, but let me summarize that the assumed 20% reduction in ad sales would seem to be a significantly exaggerated response given existing advertising patterns, the voluntary nature of the guidelines, and the likely shifting of ad dollars to other products or to targeting other age groups. Even if it were the case that an advertising reduction led to fewer sales in the food and beverage industry, consumers would simply shift some or all of those expenditures to products in other industries. A realistic assessment is that the proposed guidelines would have, at most, a modest impact on overall advertising levels and an even more modest impact on industry-level sales and employment. And even if there were a job impact at the industry level, the shifts to other industries would likely yield job increases that would offset some or all of the impact on the food and beverage industry. As I said earlier, I am an economist, and I'm concerned with the health of the economy. However, as a father, I am primarily concerned with the health of my 2 daughters. I am well aware of the challenges of getting a 3-year-old to eat healthy. In my family, fruits and vegetables are sometimes ketchup and French fries. I realize that my girls will see thousands of ads while they grow up, but I would much prefer that the advertising that they do see be for healthier products. As an economist, I think that the IWG guidelines would primarily result in a shift of ad dollars towards healthier products and not a reduction in overall industry advertising, sales, or jobs. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, panel, for your prepared testimony. We'll now begin questioning, and I will recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Mr. Bachman, should the IWG withdraw its recommendations and start over? If you believe that, why?
Well, yes, I do believe that. As I said in my prepared statement, IWG has really focused on idealized foods, and I was heartened to hear that, in fact, they are looking at the precedent that we set as part of the CFBAI to look at different foods differently because they play a different role in the diet, and they offer different pluses and minuses, if you will, in the diet. Even within categories of foods, there are differences in how much, for instance, how much whole grain you could put in something, how much salt it may need to be palatable. So, yeah, the approach that they have taken has really been not a productive one.
Mr. Jaffe, should the IWG withdraw its recommendations and start over? If you believe that, tell us why.
Yes, I do. And as I said in my testimony earlier, we believe these are very radical proposals. There is nothing in the proposals that answer this key question that the Congress has asked, which is how these proposals, if acceded to by industry, would affect obesity. We think they would have extremely significant economic impacts. And so across the board, we think that the proposal as it now stands is so flawed it should be withdrawn. If it's not going to be withdrawn, at the very least, the agency should answer the 10 questions that came out of this committee and also the specific questions that were in the report before they ever file it. And I believe that because they missed the target so dramatically, and they've admitted that they have to so substantially change their report, that there should be a chance for comment from the industry once again before they finalize it.
Ms. Kolish, would you respond to that question as well?
I believe that the IWG's proposal was very unrealistic and unworkable, but I'm very heartened to hear that they are taking our new criteria into account and will be using them in their report to Congress. I think that's a very good solution.
Ms. Johnson, please respond.
Yes, I do think that the guidelines in particular, how they have put them out at this point, should be withdrawn. I think that they need to focus on conducting a study as they were told to do, and also as they're putting this together, make sure that they address the confusion that they have added to instead of helped to clarify on the nutrition front.
All right. Mr. Bachman, has your company conducted any type of economic impact analysis for implementing the IWG recommendations? What type of impact would this have on your company's ability to hire new workers or retain current ones? Can you talk about the economic impact of these recommendations on your company and others?
We have not done a study on the economic impact. What I can say is that following the nutrition criteria and the guidelines would mean that we would not be able to promote these foods to children. None of our soups, even our low sodium soups, would fail to comply because of you need a little bit of something to make things something you want to eat. And also with soups, of course, there's because it's a great deal of water in a soup. It doesn't comply with the positive food group requirements. But I think the misconception often is that food companies can control what people eat. In fact, we don't control what people eat. They control what we can sell to them. And we have to be very conscious of that, and certainly the criteria that have been set out here in their proposal are ones that would make it possible for us to comply.
Mr. Jaffe, what's the most serious problem with the IWG proposal, in your opinion?
Well, at least we represent marketers. The most serious problem from the marketing side is that, as it specifically states, it makes it impossible if people are going to accede to the command of the IWG, that a large percentage of food products currently in the marketplace would not meet the principles and not be able to be advertised. And we've heard earlier in the hearing that the numbers that were being used for the economic analysis were too high. But what was ignored is the fact that this does not just impact kids, but they have now expanded the number to those under 18, and then said that if there's 20% of the marketplace, that includes those between 12 and 17, or 30% of the marketplace between 2 and 11, that would mean that the advertisements would be treated as if they were directed just to kids. So this sweeps in an enormous amount of adult programming as well. We estimate that more than 1,700 programs on broadcast and cable would be affected. So we can't understand how anybody can claim that this is not going to have very, very significant economic impacts if most of the foods that are advertised in this country are suddenly verboten for anybody under 17, and in many programs with a substantial adult audience, as much as 80% of the audience adult, not be allowed to be advertised and still meet these criteria. So we think that this is a very radical proposal. We don't think that that's hype. We just think that's the fact.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Time's expired. Recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have my own questions that I wanted to ask, but I did want to give one of the three other panelists, Dr. Wooten, Kunkel, or Irons, an opportunity to respond to Mr. Pitts' question, if you want to, the whether or not the working group recommendation should be thrown out. I don't want all three of you because I have my own, but would any of you like to respond to that?
My response is going to be stronger than likely my colleagues. My response is that I wouldn't withdraw the IWG guidelines. I would table them, and I would table them while the Congress considers the recommendation of the Institute of Medicine, and that is if the industry could not move significantly to reduce food marketing of unhealthy food products to children in the short term, that this Congress should regulate to accomplish that. And it's been 5 years, and we haven't seen any significant improvement. What we've seen, and I'll agree with Ms. Kolish, she said there's been steady improvement. There has. We're inching to success, but we can't afford to wait 30 years to get there.
Okay. Let me go back to Mr. Bachman. I'm always happy to see somebody from a New Jersey corporation testifying, so thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I was glad to hear from your testimony that Campbell Soup agrees with Congress, the IWG, and the IOM that addresses the prevalence of childhood obesity, that should be a national priority. And we recognize that childhood obesity is simply a problem that we can't ignore. But, I think you have to have partnerships with the private sector, and that we have to find realistic and workable guidelines for food marketing to children. So I wanted to say, I think we all agree that the IWG proposal needs some reshaping, but I still believe it's an important step towards this kind of partnership, if you will. You're clearly opposed to any type of federal guidelines and suggest the proposal be eliminated altogether. So how do you instead propose that the food industry work with the federal government to address childhood obesity? What would you have us do?
Well, I do think that discussion and dialogue are important in any major public issue. And certainly, I think we as Campbell are always, interested in sitting down with anyone to talk about those kinds of issues. We've, in fact, as I believe you know, have been working with obesity experts locally in our home city of Camden in tackling hunger and obesity, and there we are working with a great number of NGOs and so forth to tackle this issue.
Well, let me ask you about the sodium, because I know you mentioned the sodium levels, and I know that CPSI also spoke about their concern with the sodium level requirements. So how, instead of the IWG, how would you propose addressing sodium levels in food products marketed to kids? Let's just talk about that. How would you propose to do it?
Well, I would propose taking the approach that we have taken as one of the members of CFBAI, which is to look at specific product categories and looking at what sort of sodium or salt is required in a particular product category to meet consumer expectations in terms of texture. Obviously, there's food safety issues, but very importantly, taste, and not have a one-size-fits-all standard. You may know that, for instance, a soup does require a lot more sodium to taste good than a yogurt. It's a savory product. If you mix up chicken meat in water with some carrots and celery and so forth, you do need some salt in order to make that a good food. And our concern is that by applying one standard for sodium across the board, that we're under the delusion that every food that we eat has to have the same exact profile. We should be eating a variety of foods, and each of those foods has its unique contributions in terms of food groups and positive nutrients, as well as the nutrients to limit. It's putting the entire diet together with a mixture of foods that we compose a healthy diet.
And Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make clear that I fully expect that the IWG is going to take, these comments into account when finalizing their guidelines, and it is my hope that, we can work in tandem to address this. I mean, it is a national epidemic, and it has to be addressed. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman and would note that I'm, Madam, not Mr.
I didn't see
Chairman.
you came back, Mary. I apologize.
It's over the record.
I certainly didn't want to think that I saw you instead of Joe there.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your time. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning, and just want to start with an observation to all of you, and that is often in the political debate here, you're either the pessimist or the optimist. We've been told this is the health of our children versus jobs in our struggling economy. And if you're an optimist, the glass is half full. If you're a pessimist, it's half empty. Well, our job needs to be to design the perfect glass. And I just don't think we've done it yet. I really don't. I'm not hearing from all of the witnesses today that we've got it perfect. And Dr. Kunkel, you mentioned that we should regulate the Institute of Medicine and that you think we should get out there and regulate. Well, I will just point out that today or yesterday there was a study released, not relative to this point, but still in the healthcare debate. It was a study released by the Archives of Internal Medicine that now says multivitamins for women causes a decreased lifespan. I mean, that's a brand new study. So you regulate, yet in an area that changes and data changes so quickly. What was healthy today might not be healthy tomorrow. I mean, we created hydrogenated oils because butter was unhealthy suddenly. I mean, and so I don't think we're there yet. And Dr. Wooten, you said that Congress wants to kill the working group. No, we don't, but we want common sense. We want to know that the FDA and the FTC and the working group are actually collaborating, working together, so that we're not constantly reinventing the problems and the unintended consequences that are created out of this mess. So, Dr. Irons, to you, though, as the economist and to the father, the crux of the matter here is the jobs. And have you really analyzed the jobs? We're talking about the advertising industry, we're talking about the food industry, and we're talking about content. Each of you critics have pretty much taken a lot of shots at the content providers. Can you talk about the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are created? Certainly what I care about is Southern California, but it will impact those people, those jobs, the seamstresses, the grips, all of the people who work in that industry. And I don't know how many of you are actually focused on those people who are trying to put food on the table for their children. So if you can speak briefly to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about those people, too. Let me just kind of throw out an example. If you look at the advertising industry, they employ about 500,000 people, plus or minus, in a given year. The food and beverage industry is about 1.5 million people per year. I think a good case study is the impact of the CFBAI guidelines. If you look at employment in those industries from 2005, before the initiative, to 2008, after the initiative was started, you find that for the economy as a whole, employment grew by about 2.3%.
Okay.
For the advertising industry, it grew by faster than that, by 3.5%. So there's at least no big macro impact.
And this is the frustration that somebody like I have with the fact that the agencies don't talk to one another. You just cited years that are even long before the digital explosion being what it is now. Content providers are struggling in an everyday world to provide content because it's all moving to the digital world, and it's out there for free. So you're looking at studies that are 6 years old, 7 years old, about the way it used to be. I mean, so for us to say, wait a minute, you don't have it right yet, is it that hard to recognize that we need to talk about today and tomorrow and going forward and what it means for jobs, not what it meant 6 years ago?
I think that's right, but the way we assess the impact in the future is to look at past experiences with these kinds of guidelines. And it looks as though there's been no major impact in the past. So like I said in my testimony, my view is that there's a shift within the industry and that it's not a reduction in advertising. It will be a shift in the kinds of products that are advertised, with at least a possibility that there could be a surge. So, I do want to recognize that it's important to assess the consequences, absolutely. But from my perspective, I don't see in the data, I don't see in the studies any major impact this would have on jobs.
But and then again, I think that those of us say that we just don't yet see major impact on the childhood obesity rate by what we're trying to do here. And I think it is very reasonable to say, when Dr. Kunkel, when you said table it, I was excited, thinking, you did mean let's talk about this a little bit further and figure out how to do something that is good for the economy and good for our children, design that perfect glass. Mr. Bachman, how have your soups changed over all the years, and when would you say the obesity epidemic really started? And have your soups changed over those years?
Well, that's a complex question.
You have 10 seconds, so you're lucky.
I think I'm well informed of obesity. Saying when the obesity epidemic began, I believe that it began, a couple of decades ago. But our soups have not really become more caloric. The difference in our soups has been really in thinking of those condensed soups that everyone is especially familiar with. The major change there has been having about 1,000 milligrams of sodium per serving not that many years ago, and gradual decreases in sodium
Just
over
briefly,
that
and I'm
time.
sorry, because your time is up, and I'd
Yes,
like to just
please.
end with one point.
Mhm.
By sodium, it would be good. You also do mean MSG, right?
I'm sorry?
MSG is really what you mean by sodium.
No, sodium, I mean salt. I mean sodium bicarbonate in a baked product, other sodium-containing compounds.
All right, my time has expired, so thank you very much. And the chair's
sorry.
happy to recognize Dr. Burgess for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate you all staying with us for so long. Mr. Jaffe, let me just ask you a couple of things. Now, in your testimony, of course, we're told these are voluntary guidelines, compliance is voluntary, but you actually imply in your testimony that there may be more to the voluntary than meets the eye. The ability to, during the research of the working group, to actually subpoena information and to get specific information from marketers. Do I understand your testimony correctly in that regard?
You're absolutely correct. And by the way, the focus cannot be just on the Federal Trade Commission. In the White House did a report on obesity, and in the course of that report, they said if the industry does not carry out adequate self-regulation, that the Federal Communications Commission should step in and limit the amount of children's advertising. And also, as you are, I'm sure, aware, for broadcast licensing, you have to operate in the public interest. You have 4 agencies who are supposedly the experts both on marketing and on health in this country, all come together and make a proposal to the Congress saying that all of this type of advertising is unhealthy for our children. Do you not think that we're going to start seeing that when people come up for their licenses, if they're continuing to run those types of ads, that they would be under challenge? There's a great deal of more compulsion here than has been expressed in this hearing. And this is not just our view. As I said, Martin Reddish, who's one of the top constitutional experts in this country, has said so.
Let me just ask you a question about that. I mean, was there in fact intimidation involved in questioning the industry?
Well, all I can say is that the fact that the industry has been as exercises this, I think, gives you a clear sense that they did not think that this was something that people could just ignore or walk away. And
we saw this during the healthcare debates. I mean, the phrase that was frequently used with the administration was you're either at the table or on the menu. This is a food hearing. That's an appropriate analogy. But was that same principle at work here with this working group?
Well, certainly we felt that if this went forward, that the Congress would now be on record as saying that the vast majority of all of the advertising that all of these companies, the restaurant industry, the beverage industry, the food industry was doing, was inappropriate and unhealthy for children. That's what these 4 agencies were claiming, and that clearly was going to put all sorts of different pressures on us, whether it came from government, whether it came from stockholders, whether it came from consumer groups. And to act as if there wasn't any pressure, I think, is very unreasonable to expect. I think the fact that 150 Congress and Senate representatives have spoken out against this report suggests that they think this is more than something that's a mere voluntary proposal.
Let me ask you something, because Mr. Pompeo, who's not here with us, asked a question in the previous panel. What's going on in other countries? I mean, are there other countries that actually restrict this type of advertising, and what has their experience been? Are any of you aware of countries that restrict this type of advertising?
I can at least start that answer, and I'm sure there are others here who could build on it. Sweden has basically banned all children's advertising across the board, not just for food advertising.
Over what period of time now has that occurred?
At least a decade. It's certainly a decade, but I think it's more than that now.
Are they able to point to any difference in rates of childhood obesity?
Their obesity rates are worse than a number of other European countries that have no restrictions.
What do they fill that advertising?
Same case for Quebec.
What are those advertising minutes? What are they filled with? Do they advertise BB guns? I mean, what are they advertising during those minutes that are no longer sold to?
I think I have to defer to others on that. All I can say is they certainly are not advertising food, beverage, restaurant products during that time frame, and yet the obesity rates have not gone down. And Quebec is another place which has tried to do the same thing. They do not have better obesity rates than the rest of the Canadian Commonwealth. So it is just not provable. And if you go look at the IOM report itself, despite the fact that people would want to dismiss it, they said that they couldn't find causation. And in fact, for 12 to 17-year-olds, it was the opposite, that they found a negative association between advertising and the consumption patterns for those groups.
I thank you for that. Dr. Kunkel, I'll just share with you that sometimes I do share in your frustration. And if I ran the world, things could be better. But we do live in a free society. I mean, if I had my way, I'd ban tobacco and alcohol as well as high fructose corn syrup. But we do live in a free society, and and honestly, Dr. Irons, it puts the responsibility of parents in a free society are even higher than if the government exerts complete control, complete regulatory control. It would be great if we lived in a perfect world, but we don't. And we all know that those things that are severely regulated, we don't always get the desired behavior that we want. So before we give up more of our freedom to something, perhaps we ought to evaluate the risks and benefits, what the trade-off is. And I'll just offer that as an observation. You're both free to respond to that.
I respect your point of view, but what we're trying to suggest is...
I'm ironically way on the left to you, but to me I'm way on the right, so it's a different in perspective.
I appreciate your point, but what we're trying to suggest is that there isn't a level playing field here, that the industry is investing nearly $2 billion annually to try to influence children's eating patterns, and it's working. And the foods that they promote are contributing to childhood obesity. So therefore...
But Mr. Bowman says he's just responding to market.
Time has expired. I'm sorry, but we have other people waiting to ask panels some questions. So the gentleman's time has expired, and the gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I've got a series of 8 questions. They're basically yes or no, and then someone may want to give a quick response. But let's work through these. Before I do, Mr. Jaffe, I just want to say to you that last week my colleagues on the Congressional International Anti-Piracy Caucus sent you a letter regarding advertising placed on pirate websites, and I wanted to highlight your comment. You told CNET Daily that the issue is of very, very high importance. It's of high importance to us and to many of the musicians and songwriters and individuals that we represent that don't get paid if there is advertising on websites. All right, now to my questions. Okay, this first one is a yes or no for all of you. Just raise your hand. Okay, yes or no, do you think the IWG guidelines can be accurately described as a new regulation? No. Raise your hand if you say no. Okay, so that's 3 of you. 4 of you, so we've got 4 no's. How many of you say yes, they are new regulations? 1, and we have 2 that can't make up their mind. Okay, so there's 1 yes. If no, let me tell you what I think about new regulation. When I look at something to see if it's a new regulation, I say, is it going to cost businesses money? Is it going to have an impact on jobs? Have we looked at the cost of the new guidelines? So those are things that go into regulation. So if you said no, why would this, how is this not going to cost money or cost jobs or be an expense to businesses to implement? Anybody have 15 seconds to offer on that?
Ms. Blackburn, I said no, but when I said no, I didn't think it was regulation. I did think it had the feel and impact of backdoor regulation, which is equally troublesome. And I'm really gratified that they have noticed that we have taken a significant step in our new criteria and will take it into account in their report to Congress. I think that's very important.
Okay. And, you know, these, the FTC, we got a letter from USDA, HHS, and FTC describing these rules as quote-unquote non-regulatory recommendations. And so that is always of concern. Okay, question number 2. We see that these are voluntary, supposedly. But how many of you think that these could end up being government standards or being used as the basis of NGO attacks, could form the basis for shareholder actions, could be used to initiate private litigation? How many of you fear that these regulations, okay, so we've got 4 of you that think it could form that kind of basis. Anyone want to comment?
I mean, that's where a lot of different questions certainly will encourage companies to follow those standards, but you can't sue a company for not following a voluntary suggestion. You can only sue them for not breaking the law.
Right, but that was not the question.
The
okay,
you can't
number 3, to see if this is needed or not, do you think this is duplicative of the FCC guidelines for marketing to children? Anyone see this as a duplication of efforts? No? Okay. All right. Number 4. Do you find it alarming that food currently sold through the WIC program, which is designed by USDA experts to provide a healthy diet for young children, could no longer be marketed under your proposal? Does that cause you concern? Any hands?
The WIC standards are stronger.
We've got 4 that
I'd
agree
like the stronger
with that.
WIC standards that they propose.
Okay, question number 5 then. Do you think that IWG guidelines raise any free speech concerns, and have you determined the likely impact on advertising revenues? So how many of you think that it would cause free speech concerns? May I see your hands? So we've got 4 that are there. And do you think it's going to have an impact on on advertising revenues? We've got 2, okay? How many think these guidelines will actually do something to reduce obesity? We've got 2, okay? How many support or sponsor exercise programs in your companies or your organizations? We've got 3 that believe in exercise, which is a big part of reducing childhood obesity. Okay, how many favor regulating websites, mobile devices, or point of purchase access to children? Would you go in and regulate what's on a website, what's on a mobile device, like a mobile TV? Would you regulate access at point of purchase, like when a child's in the grocery store with their parent? How many of you would extend your guidelines, your marketing guidelines to that?
These aren't regulations, they are suggestions. So,
and we know where regulations get their genesis. Thank you all so much. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and the chair is pleased to recognize Dr. Cassidy for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. It's kind of a confusing hearing for me because there's really a kind of disagreement on questions of fact. I mean, the gentleman from FTC said, Mr. Vladeck, said he cannot think of a single time when principles have led to litigation or to rules. And here we have folks putting their hand on a Bible, raising and saying, heck, this is our existential anxiety. This is what it will lead to. Mr. Jaffe, just to pick you, if Mr. Vladeck were here, if I were channeling my Mr. Vladeck right to you, and you had a chance to reply to him saying there's never been an example, and he gave the example of principles regarding violence in video games, and et cetera, what would you say? I mean, he says there's never an example, but for you it's an anxiety.
Well, that's clearly wrong. There's the Bantam Book case where the Supreme Court clearly acted before there had been any overt regulation. And I would then quote to him Professor Sullivan, who was, as I mentioned earlier, the former dean of the Stanford Law School, is a chair at the school still. And it said, Professor Sullivan further notes that government action undertaken with the purpose and predictable effect of curbing truthful speech is de facto regulation. And
but they would reply that this is not to curb speech. This is to give. This isn't to curb. It's just going to be like me telling my son, boy, when you're out on the tennis court, don't get, behave in a certain way. And he goes out and behaves as he wishes. But you follow what I'm saying? I mean, this isn't.
But what she says is even where the mode of censorship is informal and even where the acceptance of speech restrictive conditions is nominally voluntary, the Supreme Court has long held that such efforts are unconstitutional.
Dr. Kunkel, what would you say to that, man? Or Dr. Irons, or anybody who would disagree with Mr. Jaffe?
I mean, there's a letter from 38 very esteemed legal scholars that have a very different opinion than the industry's hired attorneys.
Now, this guy's at Stanford. The person whom they quoted is at Stanford.
And ours are from Yale and Harvard and all over
But what I'm
as well.
saying is, I mean, in a sense, you deprecate him by saying he's hired, but I mean, theoretically, he's
got 2, we have 40.
Now, I will say,
I mean, I don't know.
So
I don't think it's the way. It's
let
not
me ask
the
you, Dr.
common
Wooten.
opinion.
I just have limited time. I don't mean to interrupt or be rude. I apologize. So I'm looking here, Institute of Medicine, and because you quoted him, I said, well, let me go IOM. And they have a thing here using litigation to change policies and practices regarding childhood obesity. And so I have to admit, I'm, in a sense, thinking, wow. Litigation can raise public awareness of an issue, result in disclosure of important documents, and it goes through strategies, advantages, disadvantages of litigation. That would seem to support, though, what these folks are saying, that there are actually people out there who think, how can I use a lawsuit to push the envelope? You see what I'm saying?
The litigation that is being referenced, I'm sorry.
No.
The litigation that they're talking about is existing legal standards. For example, misleading information. So there are organizations and there are government agencies that have litigated against the food marketing industry when they claim that their products are healthy by putting, let's say, a smart choice check on it, when in fact it has significant evidence that the product contains elements that make it unhealthy.
Now, so I have something which is a high fiber, sugar coated.
How
something.
much? Sugar-coated can be a thin veneer. It can be loaded and loaded.
So I think what we just agreed upon is that there's a level of subjectivity here. Now, high fiber may be what, sends you to the restroom after eating breakfast.
The subjectivity is where do you draw the line?
Yes.
No one would disagree that excess amounts of sugar is healthy.
Now, but they may disagree as to what is excess.
Yes. Where to draw the line is
where to draw the line. So you could say it's healthy based upon fiber content, but then get dinged because of sugar?
We know many foods are so far over the line in the unhealthy side of the equation that they're contributing to childhood obesity.
So let me stop you right there. I got your point. Ms. Kolish, I'll throw it to you, but this may be a different question. I mean, there are articles in the medical literature that our children will have a shorter lifespan than we because of obesity. If not this remedy for obesity, what?
I think self-regulation, advertising self-regulation alone is not going to cure the obesity problem. We need the joint efforts of everyone. But self-regulation is doing an outstanding job of reducing sugars, fats.
But is it reducing childhood obesity?
I don't think, and it's a multifaceted problem, and I don't think you can take that factor alone and say it by itself is reducing obesity or causing obesity. So I can't answer that. I don't think anyone could.
I'm out of time. I wish we were sitting around drinking Diet Coke discussing further. So anyway, thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the good doctor. Not sure about Diet Coke being healthy for you. But So I'd like to begin wrapping up and to thank all of our witnesses today and to assure you that, I am happy to work with you. I know our subcommittee, until we get this right, to continue visiting it. I'd like to thank the Health Subcommittee, their staff, for their hard work with today, as well as the subcommittee and members of the CMT subcommittee. So we will remind members to have 10 business days to submit questions for the record. I ask the witnesses to please respond promptly to those questions. Members should submit those questions by the close of business on October 26th, and the subcommittees are now adjourned.